The World in a Man of War by Herman Melville. Part 2. Chapter 21. One reason why men of war's men are generally short-lived. I cannot quit this matter of the hammocks without making mention of a grievance among the sailors that ought to be redressed. In a man of war at sea, the sailors have watch and watch. That is, through every 24 hours they are on and off duty every 4 hours. Now, the hammocks are piped down from the nettings, the open space for stowing them, running round the top of the bulwarks, a little after sunset, and piped up again when the forenoon watch is called at 8 o'clock in the morning, so that during the daytime they are inaccessible as pallets. This would be all well enough, did the sailors have a complete night's rest. But every other night at sea, one watch have only 4 hours in their hammocks. Indeed, deducting the time allowed for the other watch to turn out, for yourself to arrange your hammock, get into it, and fairly get asleep, it may be said that every other night you have but 3 hours sleep in your hammock. Having then been on deck for twice 4 hours, at 8 o'clock in the morning your watch below comes round, and you are not liable to duty until noon. Under like circumstances, a merchant seaman goes to his bunk, and has the benefit of a good long sleep. But in a man of war you can do no such thing. Your hammock is very neatly stowed in the nettings, and there it must remain till nightfall. But perhaps there is a corner for you somewhere along the batteries on the gun deck, where you may enjoy a snug nap. But as no one is allowed to recline on the larboard side of the gun deck, which is reserved as a corridor for the officers when they go forward to their smoking room at the bridle port, the starboard side only is left to the seamen. But most of this side, also, is occupied by the carpenters, sailmakers, barbers, and coopers. In short, so few are the corners where you can snatch a nap during daytime in a frigate, that not 1 in 10 of the watch, who have been on deck 8 hours, can get a wink of sleep till the following night. Repeatedly, after by good fortune securing a corner, I have been roused from it by some functionary commissioned to keep it clear. Off Cape Horn, what before had been very uncomfortable became a serious hardship. Drenched through and through by the spray of the sea at night, I have sometimes slept standing on the spar deck, and shuddered as I slept, for the want of sufficient sleep in my hammock. During 3 days of the stormiest weather, we were given the privilege of the berth deck, at other times strictly interdicted, where we were permitted to spread our jackets, and take a nap in the morning after the 8 hours' night exposure. But this privilege was but a beggarly one, indeed. Not to speak of our jackets, used for blankets. Being soaking wet, the spray, coming down the hatchways, kept the planks of the berth deck itself constantly wet. Whereas, had we been permitted our hammocks, we might have swung dry over all this deluge. But we endeavored to make ourselves as warm and comfortable as possible, chiefly by close stowing, so as to generate a little steam, in the absence of any fireside warmth. You have seen, perhaps, the way in which they box up subjects intended to illustrate the winter lectures of a professor of surgery. Just so we laid, heel and point, face to back, dovetailed into each other at every ham and knee. The wet of our jackets, thus densely packed, would soon begin to distill. But it was like pouring hot water on you to keep you from freezing. It was like being packed between the soaked sheets in a water-cure establishment. Such a posture could not be preserved for any considerable period without shifting side for side. 3 or 4 times during the 4 hours I would be startled from a wet doze by the hoarse cry of a fellow who did the duty of a corporal at the after end of my file. "Sleepers ahoy! Stand by to slew round!" And, with a double shuffle, we all rolled in concert and found ourselves facing the taffrail instead of the bowsprit. But, however you turned, your nose was sure to stick to one or other of the steaming backs on your 2 flanks. There was some little relief in the change of odor consequent upon this. But what is the reason that, after battling out 8 stormy hours on deck at night, men of war's men are not allowed the poor boon of a dry 4 hours' nap during the day following? What is the reason? The Commodore, Captain, and First Lieutenant, Chaplain, Purser, and scores of others have all night in, just as if they were staying at a hotel on shore. And the junior lieutenants not only have their cots to go to at any time, but as only one of them is required to head the watch, and there are so many of them among whom to divide that duty, they are only on deck 4 hours to 12 hours below. In some eases the proportion is still greater, whereas, with the people it is 4 hours in and 4 hours off continually. What is the reason, then, that the common seaman should fare so hard in this matter? It would seem but a simple thing to let them get down their hammocks during the day for a nap. But no. Such a proceeding would mar the uniformity of daily events in a man of war. It seems indispensable to the picturesque effect of the spar deck that the hammocks should invariably remain stowed in the nettings between sunrise and sundown. But the chief reason is this, a reason which has sanctioned many an abuse in this world. Precedents are against it. Such a thing as sailors sleeping in their hammocks in the daytime, after being 8 hours exposed to a night storm, was hardly ever heard of in the Navy. Though, to the immortal honor of some captains be it said, the fact is upon Navy record, that off Cape Horn, they have vouchsafed the morning hammocks to their crew. Heaven bless such tender-hearted officers, and may they and their descendants, ashore or afloat, have sweet and pleasant slumbers while they live, and an undreaming siesta when they die. It is concerning such things as the subject of this chapter that special enactments of Congress are demanded. Health and comfort, so far as duly attainable under the circumstances, should be legally guaranteed to the man-of-war's men, and not left to the discretion or caprice of their commanders. Chapter 22. Washday and House Cleaning in a Man-o' War. Besides the other tribulations connected with your hammock, you must keep it snow-white and clean. Who has not observed the long rows of spotless hammocks exposed in a frigate's nettings, where, through the day, their outsides at least are kept airing? Hence it comes that there are regular mornings appointed for the scrubbing of hammocks, and such mornings are called scrub hammock mornings, and desperate is the scrubbing that ensues. Before daylight the operation begins. All hands are called, and at it they go. Every deck is spread with hammocks, fore and aft, and lucky are you if you can get sufficient superficies to spread your own hammock in. Down on their knees are 500 men, scrubbing away with brushes and brooms, jostling and crowding, and quarreling about using each other's suds, when all their purser's soap goes to create one indiscriminate yeast. Sometimes you discover that, in the dark, you have been all the while scrubbing your next neighbor's hammock instead of your own. But it is too late to begin over again, for now the word is passed for every man to advance with his hammock, that it may be tied to a net-like framework of clotheslines, and hoisted aloft to dry. That done, without delay you get together your frocks and trousers, and on the already flooded deck embark in the laundry business. You have no special bucket or basin to yourself, the ship being one vast washtub where all hands wash and rinse out and wash, till at last the word is passed again to make fast your clothes, that they also may be elevated to dry. Then on all 3 decks the operation of holy stoning begins, so called from the queer name bestowed upon the principal instruments employed. These are ponderous flat stones with long ropes at each end, by which the stones are slid about, to and fro, over the wet and sanded decks. A most wearisome, dog-like, galley-slave employment. For the byways and corners about the masts and guns, smaller stones are used, called prayer books, inasmuch as the devout operator has to down with them on his knees. Finally, a grand flooding takes place, and the decks are remorselessly thrashed with dry swabs, after which an extraordinary implement, a sort of leathern hoe called a squilgee, is used to scrape and squeeze the last dribblings of water from the planks. Concerning this squilgee, I think something of drawing up a memoir and reading it before the Academy of Arts and Sciences. It is a most curious affair. By the time all these operations are concluded it is 8 bells, and all hands are piped to breakfast upon the damp and every way disagreeable decks. Now, against this invariable daily flooding of the 3 decks of a frigate, as a man-of-war's man, White Jacket most earnestly protests. In sunless weather it keeps the sailors' quarters perpetually damp. So much so, that you can scarce sit down without running the risk of getting the lumbago. One rheumatic old sheet anchorman among us was driven to the extremity of sewing a piece of tarred canvas on the seat of his trousers. Let those neat and tidy officers who so love to see a ship kept spick and span clean, who institute vigorous search after the man who chances to drop the crumb of a biscuit on deck, when the ship is rolling in a seaway, let all such swing their hammocks with the sailors, and they would soon get sick of this daily damping of the decks. Is a ship a wooden platter, that is to be scrubbed out every morning before breakfast, even if the thermometer be at 0, and every sailor goes barefooted through the flood with the chilblains? And all the while the ship carries a doctor, well aware of Boerhaave's great maxim, keep the feet dry. He has plenty of pills to give you when you are down with a fever, the consequence of these things, but enters no protest at the outset, as it is his duty to do, against the cause that induces the fever. During the pleasant night watches, the promenading officers, mounted on their high-heeled boots, pass dry-shod, like the Israelites, over the decks. But by daybreak the roaring tide sets back, and the poor sailors are almost overwhelmed in it, like the Egyptians in the Red Sea. Oh, the chills, colds, and agues that are caught. No snug stove, grate, or fireplace to go to. No, your only way to keep warm is to keep in a blazing passion, and anathematize the custom that every morning makes a wash-house of a man of war. Look at it. Say you go on board a line of battleship. You see everything scrupulously neat. You see all the decks clear and unobstructed as the sidewalks of Wall Street of a Sunday morning. You see no trace of a sailor's dormitory. You marvel by what magic all this has brought about. And well you may. For consider that in this unobstructed fabric nearly 1,000 mortal men have to sleep, eat, wash, dress, cook, and perform all the ordinary functions of humanity. The same number of men ashore would expand themselves into a township. Is it credible, then, that this extraordinary neatness, and especially this unobstructedness of a man of war, can be brought about except by the most rigorous edicts and a very serious sacrifice, with respect to the sailors, of the domestic comforts of life? To be sure, sailors themselves do not often complain of these things. They are used to them, but man can become used even to the hardest usage. And it is because he is used to it that sometimes he does not complain of it. Of all men of war, the American ships are the most excessively neat, and have the greatest reputation for it. And of all men of war, the general discipline of the American ships is the most arbitrary. In the English Navy, the men liberally mess on tables, which, between meals, are triced up out of the way. The American sailors mess on deck, and pick up their broken biscuit, or midshipman's nuts, like fowls in a barnyard. But if this unobstructedness in an American fighting ship be, at all hazards, so desirable, why not imitate the Turks? In the Turkish Navy they have no mess chests. The sailors roll their mess things up in a rug, and thrust them under a gun. Nor do they have any hammocks. They sleep anywhere about the decks in their gregos. Indeed, come to look at it, what more does a man-of-war's man absolutely require to live in than his own skin? That's room enough, and room enough to turn in, if he but knew how to shift his spine, end for end like a ramrod, without disturbing his next neighbor. Among all men-of-war's men, it is a maxim that overneat vessels are Tartars to the crew, and perhaps it may be safely laid down that, when you see such a ship, some sort of tyranny is not very far off. In the Neversink, as in other national ships, the business of holystoning the decks was often prolonged, by way of punishment to the men, particularly of a raw, cold morning. This is one of the punishments which a lieutenant of the watch may easily inflict upon the crew, without infringing the statute which places the power of punishment solely in the hands of the captain. The abhorrence which men-of-war's men have for this protracted holystoning in cold, comfortless weather, with their bare feet exposed to the splashing inundations, is shown in a strange story, rife among them, curiously tinctured with their proverbial superstitions. The first lieutenant of an English sloop of war, a severe disciplinarian, was uncommonly particular concerning the whiteness of the quarter-deck. One bitter winter morning at sea, when the crew had washed that part of the vessel, as usual, and put away their holystones, this officer came on deck, and after inspecting it, ordered the holystones and prayer books up again. Once more slipping off the shoes from their frosted feet, and rolling up their trousers, the crew kneeled down to their task, and in that suppliant posture, silently invoked a curse upon their tyrant, praying, as he went below, that he might never more come out of the wardroom alive. The prayer seemed answered, for shortly after being visited with a paralytic stroke at his breakfast table, the first lieutenant next morning was carried out of the wardroom feet foremost, dead. As they dropped him over the side, so goes the story, the marine sentry at the gangway turned his back upon the corpse. To the credit of the humane and sensible portion of the roll of American Navy captains, be it added, that they are not so particular in keeping the decks spotless at all times, and in all weathers, nor do they torment the men with scraping bright wood and polishing ring-bolts, but give all such gingerbread work a hardy coat of black paint, which looks more warlike, is a better preservative, and exempts the sailors from a perpetual annoyance. Chapter 23. Theatricals in a Man-o'-War. The Neversink had summered out her last Christmas on the equator. She was now destined to winter out the 4th of July not very far from the frigid latitudes of Cape Horn. It is sometimes the custom in the American Navy to celebrate this national holiday by doubling the allowance of spirits to the men. That is, if the ship happened to be lying in harbor. The effects of this patriotic plan may be easily imagined. The whole ship is converted into a dram shop, and the intoxicated sailors reel about on all 3 decks, singing, howling, and fighting. This is the time that, owing to the relaxed discipline of the ship, old and almost forgotten quarrels are revived, under the stimulus of drink, and fencing themselves up between the guns, so as to be sure of a clear space with at least 3 walls. The combatants, 2 and 2, fight out their hate, cribbed and cabined like soldiers dueling in a sentry box. In a word, scenes ensue which would not for a single instant be tolerated by the officers upon any other occasion. This is the time that the most venerable of quarter-gunners and quartermasters, together with the smallest apprentice boys, and men never known to have been previously intoxicated during the cruise, this is the time that they all roll together in the same muddy trough of drunkenness. In emulation of the potentates of the Middle Ages, some captains augment the din by authorizing a grand jail delivery of all the prisoners who, on that auspicious 4th of the month, may happen to be confined in the ship's prison, the brig. But from scenes like these the Neversink was happily delivered. Besides that she was now approaching a most perilous part of the ocean, which would have made it madness to intoxicate the sailors, her complete destitution of grog, even for ordinary consumption, was an obstacle altogether insuperable, even had the captain felt disposed to indulge his man-of-war's men by the most copious libations. For several days previous to the advent of the holiday, frequent conferences were held on the gun deck touching the melancholy prospects before the ship. "Too bad, too bad," cried a top man. "Think of it, shipmates, a 4th of July without grog." "I'll hoist the Commodore's pennant at half-mast that day," sighed the signal quartermaster. "And I'll turn my best uniform jacket wrong side out, to keep company with the pennant old ensign," sympathetically responded an afterguardsman. "I do," cried a forecastle man. "I could almost pipe my eye to think on't. No grog on de day dat tried men's souls," blubbered Sunshine, the galley cook. "Who would be a Yankee now?" roared a Hollander of the foretop, more Dutch than sauerkraut. "Is this the riglar fruits of liberty?" touchingly inquired an Irish waister of an old Spanish sheet anchorman. "You will generally observe that, of all Americans, your foreign-born citizens are the most patriotic, especially toward the 4th of July. But how could Captain Claret, the father of his crew, behold the grief of his ocean children with indifference? He could not. 3 days before the anniversary, it still continuing very pleasant weather for these latitudes, it was publicly announced that free permission was given to the sailors to get up any sort of theatricals they desired, wherewith to honor the 4th. Now, some weeks prior to the Neversink's sailing from home, nearly 3 years before the time here spoken of, some of the seamen had clubbed together, and made up a considerable purse, for the purpose of purchasing a theatrical outfit having in view to diversify the monotony of lying in foreign harbors for weeks together, by an occasional display on the boards, though if ever there w as a continual theater in the world, playing by night and by day, and without intervals between the acts, a man of war is that theater, and her planks are the boards indeed. The sailors who originated this scheme had served in other American frigates, where the privilege of having theatricals was allowed to the crew. What was their chagrin, then, when, upon making an application to the captain in a Peruvian harbor, for permission to present the much-admired drama of The Ruffian Boy, under the captain's personal patronage, that dignitary assured them that there were already enough ruffian boys on board, without conjuring up any more from the green room. The theatrical outfit, therefore, was stowed down in the bottom of the sailors' bags, who little anticipated then that it would ever be dragged out while Captain Claret had the sway. But immediately upon the announcement that the embargo was removed, vigorous preparations were at once commenced to celebrate the 4th with unwonted spirit. The half-deck was set apart for the theater, and the signal quartermaster was commanded to loan his flags to decorate it in the most patriotic style. As the stage-struck portion of the crew had frequently during the cruise rehearsed portions of various plays, to while away the tedium of the night watches, they needed no long time now to perfect themselves in their parts. Accordingly, on the very next morning after the indulgence had been granted by the captain, the following written placard, presenting a broadside of staring capitals, was found tacked against the mainmast on the gun deck. It was as if a Drury Lane bill had been posted upon the London Monument. Cape Horn Theatre. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Grand celebration of the 4th of July. Day performance. Uncommon attraction. The old wagon paid off. Jack Chase. Percy Royal Mast. Stars of the first magnitude. For this time only. The true Yankee sailor. The managers of the Cape Horn Theatre beg leave to inform the inhabitants of the Pacific and Southern Oceans that, on the afternoon of the 4th of July 184, they will have the honor to present the admired drama of The Old Wagon Paid Off, Commodore Bougie, Tom Brown of the foretop, Captain Spyglass, Ned Brace of the afterguard, Commodore's coxswain, Joe Bunk of the launch, Old Luff, Quartermaster Coffin, Mayor, Seafull of the forecastle, Percy Royal Mast, Jack Chase, Mrs. Lovelorn, Longlocks of the afterguard, Toddy Mall, Frank Jones, Gin and Sugar Sol, Dick Dash, sailors, mariners, barkeepers, crimps, aldermen, police officers, soldiers, landsmen generally. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Long live the Commodore. Admission free. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. To conclude with the much-admired song by Dibdin, altered to suit all American tars, entitled, The True Yankee Sailor. True Yankee Sailor, in costume, Patrick Flanagan, Captain of the Head. Performance to commence with Hail Columbia. By the brass band. Ensign rises at 3 bells p.m. No sailor permitted to enter in his shirt sleeves. Good order is expected to be maintained. The master-at-arms and ship's corporals to be in attendance to keep the peace. At the earnest entreaties of the seaman, Lemsford, the gun-deck poet, had been prevailed upon to draw up this bill. And upon this one occasion his literary abilities were far from being underrated, even by the least intellectual person on board. Nor must it be omitted that, before the bill was placarded, Captain Claret, enacting the part of censor and Grand Chamberlain, ran over a manuscript copy of The Old Wagon Paid Off, to see whether it contained anything calculated to breed disaffection against lawful authority among the crew. He objected to some parts, but in the end let them all pass. The morning of the 4th, most anxiously awaited, dawned clear and fair. The breeze was steady, the air bracing cold, and one and all the sailors anticipated a gleeful afternoon. And thus was falsified the prophecies of certain old growlers averse to theatricals, who had predicted a gale of wind that would squash all the arrangements of the green room. As the men whose regular turns, at the time of the performance, would come round to be stationed in the tops, and at the various halyards and running ropes about the spar-deck, could not be permitted to partake in the celebration, there accordingly ensued, during the morning, many amusing scenes of tars who were anxious to procure substitutes at their posts. Through the day, many anxious glances were cast to windward, but the weather still promised fair. At last the people were piped to dinner. 2 bells struck, and soon after, all who could be spared from their stations hurried to the half-deck. The capstan bars were placed on shot-boxes, as at prayers on Sundays, furnishing seats for the audience, while a low stage, rigged by the carpenter's gang, was built at one end of the open space. The curtain was composed of a large ensign, and the bulwarks round about were draperied with the flags of all nations. The 10 or 12 members of the brass band were ranged in a row at the foot of the stage, their polished instruments in their hands, while the consequential captain of the band himself was elevated upon a gun carriage. At 3 bells precisely a group of wardroom officers emerged from the after hatchway, and seated themselves upon camp stools, in a central position, with the stars and stripes for a canopy. That was the royal box. The sailors looked round for the Commodore, but neither Commodore nor captain honored the people with their presence. At the call of a bugle the band struck up Hail Columbia, the whole audience keeping time, as at Drury Lane, when God Save the King is played after a great national victory. At the discharge of a marine's musket the curtain rose, and 4 sailors, in the picturesque garb of Maltese mariners, staggered on the stage in a feigned state of intoxication. The truthfulness of the representation was much heightened by the role of the ship. The Commodore, Old Luff, the Mayor, and Gin and Sugar Sol were played to admiration and received great applause. But at the first appearance of that universal favorite, Jack Chase, in the chivalric character of Percy Royalmast, the whole audience simultaneously rose to their feet and greeted higher with 3 hearty cheers that almost took the main topsail aback. Matchless Jack, in full fig, bowed again and again, with true quarterdeck grace and self-possession, and when 5 or 6 untwisted strands of rope and bunches of oakum were thrown to him, as substitutes for bouquets, he took them one by one and gallantly hung them from the buttons of his jacket. Hurrah! 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 Go on! Go on! Stop hollering hurrah! Go on! Stop hollering hurrah! Was now heard on all sides, till at last, seeing no end to the enthusiasm of his ardent admirers, Matchless Jack stepped forward, and with his lips moving in pantomime, plunged into the thick of the part. Silence soon followed, but was 50 times broken by uncontrollable bursts of applause. At length, when that heart-thrilling scene came on, where Percy Royalmast rescues 15 oppressed sailors from the watch-house, in the teeth of a posse of constables, the audience leaped to their feet, overturned the capstan bars, and to a man hurled their hats on the stage in a delirium of delight. Ah, Jack! That was a 10-stroke indeed. The commotion was now terrific. All discipline seemed gone forever. The lieutenants ran in among the men, the captain darted from his cabin, and the Commodore nervously questioned the armed sentry at his door as to what the deuce the people were about. In the midst of all this, the trumpet of the officer of the deck, commanding the top-gallant sails to be taken in, was almost completely drowned. A black squall was coming down on the weather bow, and the boatswain's mates bellowed themselves hoarse at the main hatchway. There is no knowing what would have ensued, had not the bass drum suddenly been heard, calling all hands to quarters, a summons not to be withstood. The sailors pricked their ears at it, as horses at the sound of a cracking whip, and confusedly stumbled up the ladders to their stations. The next moment all was silent but the wind, howling like 1,000 devils in the cordage. Stand by to reef all 3 topsails. Settle away the halyards. Haul out. So, make fast. Aloft topmen, and reef away. Thus, in storm and tempest terminated that day's theatricals. But the sailors never recovered from the disappointment of not having the true Yankee sailor, sung by the Irish captain of the head. And here White Jacket must moralize a bit. The unwanted spectacle of the row of gunroom officers mingling with the people in applauding a mere seaman like Jack Chase filled me at the time with the most pleasurable emotions. It is a sweet thing, thought I, to see these officers confess a human brotherhood with us, after all. A sweet thing to mark their cordial appreciation of the manly merits of my matchless Jack. Ah, they are noble fellows all round, and I do not know but I have wronged them sometimes in my thoughts. Nor was it without similar pleasurable feelings that I witnessed the temporary rupture of the ship's stern discipline, consequent upon the tumult of the theatricals. I thought to myself, this now is as it should be. It is good to shake off, now and then, this iron yoke round our necks. And after having once permitted us sailors to be a little noisy, in a harmless way, somewhat merrily turbulent, the officers cannot, with any good grace, be so excessively stern and unyielding as before. I began to think a man of war a man of peace and goodwill, after all. But, alas, disappointment came. Next morning the same old scene was enacted at the gangway, and beholding the row of uncompromising-looking officers there assembled with the captain to witness punishment, the same officers who had been so cheerfully disposed overnight, an old sailor touched my shoulder and said, "See, White Jacket, all round they have shipped their quarter-deck faces again. But this is the way." I afterward learned that this was an old man-of-war's man's phrase, expressive of the facility with which a sea officer falls back upon all the severity of his dignity, after a temporary suspension of it. Chapter 24. Introductory to Cape Horn. And now, through drizzling fogs and vapors, and under damp, double-reefed topsails, our wet-decked frigate drew nearer and nearer to the squally cape. Who has not heard of it? Cape Horn, a horn indeed that has tossed many a good ship. Was the descent of Orpheus, Ulysses, or Dante into hell one whit more hardy and sublime than the first navigator's weathering of that terrible cape? Turned on her heel by a fierce west wind, many an outward-bound ship has been driven across the southern ocean to the Cape of Good Hope, that way to seek a passage to the Pacific. And that stormy cape, I doubt not, has sent many a fine craft to the bottom, and told no tales. At those ends of the earth are no chronicles. What signify the broken spars and shrouds that, day after day, are driven before the prows of more fortunate vessels? Or the tall masts, embedded in icebergs, that are found floating by? They but hint the old story of ships that have sailed from their ports, and never more have been heard of. Impracticable cape! You may approach it from this direction or that, in any way you please, from the east or from the west, with the wind astern or abeam or on the quarter, and still Cape Horn is Cape Horn. Cape Horn it is that takes the conceit out of fresh-water sailors, and steeps in a still salter brine the saltest. Woe betide the tyro, the foolhardy, heaven preserve, your Mediterranean captain, who with a cargo of oranges has hitherto made merry runs across the Atlantic, without so much as furling a tea-gallant sail, oftentimes, off Cape Horn, receives a lesson which he carries to the grave, though the grave, as is too often the case, follows so hard on the lesson that no benefit comes from the experience. Other strangers who draw nigh to this Patagonia termination of our continent, with their souls full of its shipwrecks and disasters, topsails cautiously reefed, and everything guardedly snug, these strangers at first unexpectedly encountering a tolerably smooth sea, rashly conclude that the Cape, after all, is but a bugbear. They have been imposed upon by fables, and founderings and sinkings hereabouts are all cock and bull stories. Out reefs, my hearties! Fore and aft set tea-gallant sails. Stand by to give her the fore-top-mast stun-sail. But, Captain Rash, those sails of yours were much safer in the sailmaker's loft. For now, while the heedless craft is bounding over the billows, a black cloud rises out of the sea. The sun drops down from the sky. A horrible mist far and wide spreads over the water. Hands by the halyards! Let go! Clew up! Too late! For ere the rope's ends can be the east off from the pins, the tornado is blowing down to the bottom of their throats. The masts are willows, the sails ribbons, the cordage wool. The whole ship is brewed into the yeast of the gale. And now, if, when the first green sea breaks over him, Captain Rash is not swept overboard, he has his hands full, be sure. In all probability his 3 masts have gone by the board, and, revelled into list, his sails are floating in the air. Or, perhaps, the ship broaches to or is brought by the lee. In either ease, heaven help the sailors, their wives and their little ones, and heaven help the underwriters. Familiarity with danger makes a brave man braver, but less daring. Thus with seamen. He who goes the oftenest round Cape Horn goes the most circumspectly. A veteran mariner is never deceived by the treacherous breezes which sometimes waft him pleasantly toward the latitude of the Cape. No sooner does he come within a certain distance of it, previously fixed in his own mind, than all hands are turned to setting the ship in storm trim, and never mind how light the breeze, down come his tea-gallant yards. He bends his strongest storm sails, and lashes everything on deck securely. The ship is then ready for the worst, and if, in reeling round the headland, she receives a broadside, it generally goes well with her. If ill, all hands go to the bottom with quiet consciences. Among sea captains, there are some who seem to regard the genius of the Cape as a willful, capricious jade, that must be courted and coaxed into complaisance. First, they come along under easy sails, do not steer boldly for the headland, but tack this way and that, sidling up to it. Now they woo the Jezebel with a tea-gallant studding sail. Anon, they deprecate her wrath with double-reefed topsails. When, at length, her unappeasable fury is fairly aroused, and all round the dismantled ship the storm howls and howls for days together, they still persevere in their efforts. First, they try unconditional submission, furling every rag and heaving to, laying like a log, for the tempest to toss wheresoever it pleases. This failing, they set a spencer or trysail and shift on the other tack. Equally vain, the gale sings as hoarsely as before. At last, the wind comes round fair. They drop the foresail, square the yards and scud before it. their implacable foe chasing them with tornadoes, as if to show her insensibility to the last. Other ships, without encountering these terrible gales, spend week after week endeavoring to turn this boisterous world corner against a continual headwind. Tacking hither and thither, in the language of sailors they polish the Cape by beating about its edges so long. Le Maire and Schouten, two Dutchmen, were the first navigators who weathered Cape Horn. Previous to this, passages had been made to the Pacific by the Straits of Magellan. Nor, indeed, at that period, was it known to a certainty that there was any other route, or that the land now called Terra del Fuego was an island. A few leagues southward from Terra del Fuego is a cluster of small islands, the Diegos, between which and the former island are the Straits of Le Maire, so called in honor of their discoverer, who first sailed through them into the Pacific. Le Maire and Schouten, in their small, clumsy vessels, encountered a series of tremendous gales, the prelude to the long train of similar hardships which most of their followers have experienced. It is a significant fact that Schouten's vessel, the Horn, which gave its name to the Cape, was almost lost in weathering it. The next navigator round the Cape was Sir Francis Drake, who, on Raleigh's expedition, beholding for the first time, from the Isthmus of Darien, the goodly South Sea, like a true-born Englishman vowed, please God, to sail an English ship thereon, which the gallant sailor did, to the sore discomfiture of the Spaniards on the coasts of Chile and Peru. But perhaps the greatest hardships on record, in making this celebrated passage, were those experienced by Lord Anson's squadron in 1736. Three remarkable and most interesting narratives record their disasters and sufferings. The first, jointly written by the carpenter and gunner of the Wager. The second by young Byron, a midshipman in the same ship. The third by the chaplain of the Centurion. White Jacket has them all, and they are fine reading of a boisterous March night, with the casement rattling in your ear, and the chimney stacks blowing down upon the pavement, bubbling with raindrops. But if you want the best idea of Cape Horn, get my friend Dana's unmatchable 2 Years Before the Mast. But you can read, and so you must have read it. His chapters describing Cape Horn must have been written with an icicle. At the present day, the horrors of the Cape have somewhat abated. This is owing to a growing familiarity with it, but, more than all, to the improved condition of ships in all respects, and the means now generally in use of preserving the health of the crews in times of severe and prolonged exposure. Chapter 25. The Dog Days off Cape Horn. Colder and colder. We are drawing nigh to the Cape. Now Gregos, pea jackets, monkey jackets, reefing jackets, storm jackets, oil jackets, paint jackets, round jackets, short jackets, long jackets, and all manner of jackets are the order of the day, not excepting the immortal white jacket, which begins to be sturdily buttoned up to the throat and pulled down vigorously at the skirts to bring them well over the loins. But, alas! Those skirts were lamentably scanty, and though, with its quiltings, the jacket was stuffed out about the breasts like a Christmas turkey, and of a dry cold day kept the wearer warm enough in that vicinity, yet about the loins it was shorter than ballet dancers' skirts, so that while my chest was in the temperate zone close adjoining the torrid, my hapless thighs were in Nova Zembla, hardly an icicle's toss from the pole. Then, again, the repeated soakings and dryings it had undergone had by this time made it shrink woefully all over, especially in the arms, so that the wristbands had gradually crawled up near to the elbows, and it required an energetic thrust to push the arm through, in drawing the jacket on. I endeavored to amend these misfortunes by sewing a sort of canvas ruffle round the skirts, by way of a continuation or supplement to the original work, and by doing the same with the wristbands. This is the time for oilskin suits, dreadnoughts, tarred trousers and overalls, sea boots, comforters, mittens, woolen socks, Guernsey frocks, Havre shirts, buffalo robe shirts, and moose skin drawers. Every man's jacket is his wigwam, and every man's hat his caboose. Perfect license is now permitted to the men respecting their clothing. Whatever they can rake and scrape together they put on, swaddling themselves in old sails, and drawing old socks over their heads for nightcaps. This is the time for smiting your chest with your hand, and talking loud to keep up the circulation. Colder, and colder, and colder, till at last we spoke a fleet of icebergs bound north. After that, it was one incessant cold snap, that almost snapped off our fingers and toes. Cold. It was cold as blue flugine, where sailors say fire freezes. And now coming up with the latitude of the Cape, we stood southward to give it a wide berth, and while so doing were becalmed. I becalmed off Cape Horn, which is worse, far worse, than being becalmed on the line. Here we lay 48 hours, during which the cold was intense. I wondered at the liquid sea, which refused to freeze in such a temperature. The clear, cold sky overhead looked like a steel-blue cymbal that might ring, could you smite it. Our breath came and went like puffs of smoke from pipe bowls. At first there was a long gawky swell that obliged us to furl most of the sails, and even send down t-gallant yards, for fear of pitching them overboard. Out of sight of land, at this extremity of both the inhabitable and uninhabitable world, our peopled frigate, echoing with the voices of men, the bleating of lambs, the cackling of fowls, the gruntings of pigs, seemed like Noah's old ark itself, becalmed at the climax of the deluge. There was nothing to be done but patiently to await the pleasure of the elements, and whistle for a wind, the usual practice of seamen in a calm. No fire was allowed, except for the indispensable purpose of cooking, and heating bottles of water to toast Selvagee's feet. He who possessed the largest stock of vitality stood the best chance to escape freezing. It was horrifying. In such weather any man could have undergone amputation with great ease, and helped take up the arteries himself. Indeed, this state of affairs had not lasted quite 24 hours, when the extreme frigidity of the air, united to our increased tendency to inactivity, would very soon have rendered some of us subjects for the surgeon and his mates, had not a humane proceeding of the captain suddenly impelled us to vigorous exercise. And here be it said, that the appearance of the boatswain, with his silver whistle to his mouth, at the main hatchway of the gun-deck, is always regarded by the crew with the utmost curiosity, for this betokens that some general order is about to be promulgated through the ship. What now? Is the question that runs on from man to man. A short preliminary whistle is then given by Old Yarn, as they call him, which whistle serves to collect round him, from their various stations, his four mates. Then Yarn, or Pipes, as leader of the orchestra, begins a peculiar call, in which his assistants join. This over, the order, whatever it may be, is loudly sung out and prolonged, till the remotest corner echoes again. The boatswain and his mates are the town criers of a man of war. The calm had commenced in the afternoon, and the following morning the ship's company were electrified by a general order, thus set forth and declared, "D'ye hear there, fore and aft? All hands skylark." This mandate, nowadays never used except upon very rare occasions, produced the same effect upon the men that exhilarating gas would have done, or an extra allowance of grog. For a time, the wonted discipline of the ship was broken through, and perfect license allowed. It was a babel here, a bedlam there, and a pandemonium everywhere. The theatricals were nothing compared with it. Then the faint-hearted and timorous crawled to their hiding places, and the lusty and bold shouted forth their glee. Gangs of men, in all sorts of outlandish habiliments, wild as those worn at some crazy carnival, rushed to and fro, seizing upon whomsoever they pleased, warrant officers and dangerous pugilists excepted, pulling and hauling the luckless tars about, till fairly baited into a genial warmth. Some were made fast to and hoisted aloft with a will. Others, mounted upon oars, were ridden fore and aft on a rail, to the boisterous mirth of the spectators, any one of whom might be the next victim. Swings were rigged from the tops or the masts, and the most reluctant wights being purposely selected, spite of all struggles, were swung from east to west, in vast arcs of circles, till almost breathless. Hornpipes, fandangos, Donnabrook jigs, reels, and quadrilles were danced under the very nose of the most mighty captain, and upon the very quarter-deck and poop. Sparring and wrestling, too, were all the vogue. Kentucky bites were given, and the Indian hug exchanged. The din frightened the seafowl, that flew by with accelerated wing. It is worth mentioning that several casualties occurred, of which, however, I will relate but one. While the skylarking was at its height, one of the foretopmen, an ugly-tempered devil of a Portuguese, looking on, swore that he would be the death of any man who laid violent hands upon his inviolable person. This threat being overheard, a band of desperadoes, coming up from behind, tripped him up in an instant, and in the twinkling of an eye the Portuguese was straddling an oar, borne aloft by an uproarious multitude, who rushed him along the deck at a railroad gallop. The living mass of arms all round and beneath him was so dense, that every time he inclined one side he was instantly pushed upright, but only to fall over again, to receive another push from the contrary direction. Presently, disengaging his hands from those who held them, the enraged seaman drew from his bosom an iron belaying pin, and recklessly laid about him to right and left. Most of his persecutors fled, but some 8 or 10 still stood their ground, and, while bearing him aloft, endeavored to wrest the weapon from his hands. In this attempt, one man was struck on the head and dropped insensible. He was taken up for dead, and carried below to Cuticle, the surgeon, while the Portuguese was put under guard. But the wound did not prove very serious, and in a few days the man was walking about the deck, with his head well bandaged. This occurrence put an end to the skylarking, further head-breaking being strictly prohibited. In due time the Portuguese paid the penalty of his rashness at the gangway, while once again the officers shipped their quarter-deck faces. Chapter 26. The Pitch of the Cape. Ere the calm had yet left us, a sail had been discerned from the foretopmast-head, at a great distance, probably 3 leagues or more. At first it was a mere speck, altogether out of sight from the deck. By the force of attraction or something else equally inscrutable, 2 ships in a calm, and equally affected by the currents, will always approximate more or less. Though there was not a breath of wind, it was not a great while before the strange sail was descried from our bulwarks. Gradually it drew still nearer. What was she, and whence? There is no object which so excites interest and conjecture, and, at the same time, baffles both as a sail, seen as a mere speck on these remote seas off Cape Horn. A breeze! A breeze! For lo! The stranger is now perceptibly nearing the frigate. The officer's spyglass pronounces her a full-rigged ship, with all sail set, and coming right down to us, though in our own vicinity the calm still reigns. She is bringing the wind with her. Hurrah! Aye, there it is! Behold how mincingly it creeps over the sea, just ruffling and crisping it. Our topmen were at once sent aloft to loose the sails, and presently they faintly began to distend. As yet we hardly had steerage way. Towards sunset the stranger bore down before the wind, a complete pyramid of canvas. Never before, I venture to say, was Cape Horn so audaciously insulted. Stunsails alow and aloft, royals, moonsails, and everything else. She glided under our stern, within hailing distance, and the signal quartermaster ran up our ensign to the gaff. "Ship ahoy!" cried the lieutenant of the watch, through his trumpet. "Hullo!" bawled an old fellow in a green jacket, clapping one hand to his mouth, while he held on with the other to the mizzen shrouds. "What ship's that?" "The Sultan, Indiaman, from New York, and bound to Callao and Canton, 60 days out, all well." "What frigate's that?" "The United States ship Neversink, homeward bound." "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" yelled our enthusiastic countrymen, transported with patriotism. By this time the Sultan had swept past, but the lieutenant of the watch could not withhold a parting admonition. "D'ye hear? You'd better take in some of your flying kites there. Look out for Cape Horn." But the friendly advice was lost in the now increasing wind. With a suddenness by no means unusual in these latitudes, the light breeze soon became a succession of sharp squalls, and our sail-proud braggadocio of an Indiaman was observed to let everything go by the run, his t-gallant stunsails and flying jib taking quick leave of the spars. The flying jib was swept into the air, rolled together for a few minutes, and tossed about in the squalls like a football. But the wind played no such pranks with the more prudently managed canvas of the Neversink, though before many hours it was stirring times with us. About midnight, when the starboard watch to which I belonged was below, the boatswain's whistle was heard, followed by the shrill cry of "All hands take in sail! Jump, men, and save ship!" Springing from our hammocks, we found the frigate leaning over to it so steeply that it was with difficulty we could climb the ladders leading to the upper deck. Here the scene was awful. The vessel seemed to be sailing on her side. The main deck guns had several days previous been run in and housed, and the portholes closed, but the lee carronades on the quarter-deck and forecastle were plunging through the sea, which undulated over them in milk-white billows of foam. With every lurch to leeward the yard arm ends seemed to dip in the sea, while forward the spray dashed over the bows in cataracts, and drenched the men who were on the foreyard. By this time the deck was alive with the whole strength of the ship's company. 500 men, officers and all, mostly clinging to the weather bulwarks. The occasional phosphorescence of the yeasting sea cast a glare upon their uplifted faces, as a night fire in a populous city lights up the panic-stricken crowd. In a sudden gale, or when a large quantity of sail is suddenly to be furled, it is the custom for the first lieutenant to take the trumpet from whoever happens then to be officer of the deck. But Mad Jack had the trumpet that watch, nor did the first lieutenant now seek to wrest it from his hands. Every eye was upon him, as if we had chosen him from among us all, to decide this battle with the elements, by single combat with the spirit of the Cape. For Mad Jack was the saving genius of the ship, and so proved himself that night. I owe this right hand, that is this moment flying over my sheet, and all my present being to Mad Jack. The ship's bows were now butting, battering, ramming, and thundering over and upon the head seas, and with a horrible wallowing sound our whole hull was rolling in the trough of the foam. The gale came athwart the deck, and every sail seemed bursting with its wild breath. All the quartermasters, and several of the forecastle men, were swarming round the double wheel on the quarter-deck, some jumping up and down with their hands upon the spokes, for the whole helm and galvanized keel were fiercely feverish, with the life imparted to them by the tempest. "Hard up the helm!" shouted Captain Claret, bursting from his cabin like a ghost in his night dress. "Damn you!" raged Mad Jack to the quartermasters. Hard down, I say, and be damned to you." Contrary orders. But Mad Jack's were obeyed. His object was to throw the ship into the wind, so as the better to admit of close reefing the topsails. But though the halyards were let go, it was impossible to clew down the yards, owing to the enormous horizontal strain on the canvas. It now blew a hurricane. The spray flew over the ship in floods. The gigantic masts seemed about to snap under the worldwide strain of the 3 entire topsails. "Clew down! Clew down!" shouted Mad Jack, husky with excitement, and in a frenzy, beating his trumpet against one of the shrouds. But, owing to the slant of the ship, the thing could not be done. It was obvious that before many minutes something must go. Either sails, rigging, or sticks, perhaps the hull itself and all hands. Presently a voice from the top exclaimed that there was a rent in the maintopsail, and instantly we heard a report like 2 or 3 muskets discharged together. The vast sail was rent up and down like the veil of the temple. This saved the mainmast, for the yard was now clewed down with comparative ease, and the topmen laid out to stow the shattered canvas. Soon, the 2 remaining topsails were also clewed down and close reefed. Above all the roar of the tempest and the shouts of the crew, was heard the dismal tolling of the ship's bell, almost as large as that of a village church, which the violent rolling of the ship was occasioning. Imagination cannot conceive the horror of such a sound in a night tempest at sea. "Stop that ghost!" roared Mad Jack. "Away, one of you, and wrench off the clapper!" But no sooner was this ghost gagged, than a still more appalling sound was heard, the rolling to and fro of the heavy shot, which, on the gun deck, had broken loose from the gun racks, and converted that part of the ship into an immense bowling alley. Some hands were sent down to secure them, but it was as much as their lives were worth. Several were maimed, and the midshipmen who were ordered to see the duty performed reported it impossible, until the storm abated. The most terrific job of all was to furl the mainsail, which, at the commencement of the squalls, had been clewed up, coaxed and quieted as much as possible with the buntlines and slab lines. Mad Jack waited some time for a lull, ere he gave an order so perilous to be executed. For to furl this enormous sail in such a gale required at least 50 men on the yard, whose weight, superadded to that of the ponderous stick itself, still further jeopardized their lives. But there was no prospect of a cessation of the gale, and the order was at last given. At this time a hurricane of slanting sleet and hail was descending upon us. The rigging was coated with a thin glare of ice, formed within the hour. "Aloft, main yardmen, and all you main-top-men, and furl the mainsail!" cried Mad Jack. I dashed down my hat, slipped out of my quilted jacket in an instant, kicked the shoes from my feet, and, with a crowd of others, sprang for the rigging. Above the bulwarks, which in a frigate are so high as to afford much protection to those on deck, the gale was horrible. The sheer force of the wind flattened us to the rigging as we ascended, and every hand seemed congealing to the icy shrouds by which we held. "Up, up, my brave hearties!" shouted Mad Jack. And up we got, some way or other, all of us, and groped our way out on the yard arms. "Hold on, every mother's son!" cried an old quarter-gunner at my side. He was bawling at the top of his compass, but in the gale he seemed to be whispering, and I only heard him from his being right to windward of me. But his hint was unnecessary. I dug my nails into the jackstays, and swore that nothing but death should part me and them until I was able to turn round and look to windward. As yet, this was impossible. I could scarcely hear the man to leeward at my elbow. The wind seemed to snatch the words from his mouth and fly away with them to the South Pole. All this while the sail itself was flying about, sometimes catching over our heads, and threatening to tear us from the yard in spite of all our hugging. For about 3/4 of an hour we thus hung suspended right over the rampant billows, which curled their very crests under the feet of some 4 or 5 of us clinging to the lee-yard arm, as if to float us from our place. Presently, the word passed along the yard from windward, that we were ordered to come down and leave the sail to blow, since it could not be furled. A midshipman, it seemed, had been sent up by the officer of the deck to give the order, as no trumpet could be heard where we were. Those on the weather yard arm managed to crawl upon the spar and scramble down the rigging. But with us, upon the extreme leeward side, this feat was out of the question. It was literary, like climbing a precipice to get to windward in order to reach the shrouds. Besides, the entire yard was now encased in ice, and our hands and feet were so numb that we dared not trust our lives to them. Nevertheless, by assisting each other, we contrived to throw ourselves prostrate along the yard, and embrace it with our arms and legs. In this position, the stun-sail booms greatly assisted in securing our hold. Strange as it may appear, I do not suppose that, at this moment, the slightest sensation of fear was felt by one man on that yard. We clung to it with might and main, but this was instinct. The truth is that, in circumstances like these, the sense of fear is annihilated in the unutterable sights that fill all the eye, and the sounds that fill all the ear. You become identified with the tempest. Your insignificance is lost in the riot of the stormy universe around. Below us, our noble frigate seemed thrice its real length, a vast black wedge, opposing its widest end to the combined fury of the sea and wind. At length the first fury of the gale began to abate, and we at once fell to pounding our hands, as a preliminary operation to going to work. For a gang of men had now ascended to help secure what was left of the sail. We somehow packed it away at last and came down. About noon the next day, the gale so moderated that we shook 2 reefs out of the topsails, set new courses, and stood due east with the wind astern. Thus, all the fine weather we encountered after first weighing anchor on the pleasant Spanish coast was but the prelude to this one terrific night, more especially that treacherous calm immediately preceding it. But how could we reach our long-promised homes without encountering Cape Horn? By what possibility avoid it? And though some ships have weathered it without these perils, yet by far the greater part must encounter them. Lucky it is that it comes about midway in the homeward-bound passage, so that the sailors have time to prepare for it, and time to recover from it after it is astern. But, sailor or landsman, there is some sort of a Cape Horn for all. Boys, beware of it. Prepare for it in time. Greybeards, thank God it is past. And ye lucky livers, to whom, by some rare fatality, your Cape Horns are placid as lake lemons, flatter not yourselves that good luck is judgment and discretion. For all the yolk in your eggs, you might have foundered and gone down, had the spirit of the Cape said the word. Chapter 27. Some thoughts growing out of Mad Jack's countermanding his superior's order. In time of peril, like the needle to the lodestone, obedience, irrespective of rank, generally flies to him who is best fitted to command. The truth of this seemed evinced in the case of Mad Jack, during the gale, and especially at that perilous moment when he countermanded the captain's order at the helm. But every seaman knew, at the time, that the captain's order was an unwise one in the extreme, perhaps worse than unwise. These 2 orders given by the captain and his lieutenant exactly contrasted their characters. By putting the helm hard up, the captain was for scudding, that is, for flying away from the gale, whereas Mad Jack was for running the ship into its teeth. It is needless to say that, in almost all cases of similar hard squalls and gales, the latter step, though attended with more appalling appearances, is, in reality, the safer of the two, and the most generally adopted. Scudding makes you a slave to the blast, which drives you headlong before it. But running up into the wind's eye enables you, in a degree, to hold it at bay. Scudding exposes to the gale your stern, the weakest part of your hull. The contrary course presents to it your bows, your strongest part. As with ships, so with men. He who turns his back to his foe gives him an advantage. Whereas our ribbed chests, like the ribbed bows of a frigate, are as bulkheads to dam off an onset. That night, off the pitch of the Cape, Captain Claret was hurried forth from his disguises, and, at a manhood-testing conjuncture, appeared in his true colors. A thing which every man in the ship had long suspected that night was proved true. Hitherto, in going about the ship, and casting his glances among the men, the peculiarly lusterless repose of the captain's eye, his slow, even unnecessarily methodical step, and the forced firmness of his whole demeanor, though, to a casual observer, expressive of the consciousness of command and a desire to strike subjection among the crew, all this, to some minds, had only been deemed indications of the fact that Captain Claret, while carefully shunning positive excesses, continually kept himself in an uncertain equilibrio between soberness and its reverse, which equilibrio might be destroyed by the first sharp vicissitude of events. And though this is only a surmise, nevertheless, as having some knowledge of brandy and mankind, White Jacket will venture to state that, had Captain Claret been an out-and-out temperance man, he would never have given that most imprudent order to hard up the helm. He would either have held his peace, and stayed in his cabin, like his gracious Majesty the Commodore, or else have anticipated Mad Jack's order, and thundered forth hard down the helm, to show how little real sway at times have the severest restrictive laws, and how spontaneous is the instinct of discretion in some minds. It must here be added, that though Mad Jack, under a hot impulse, had countermanded an order of his superior officer before his very face, yet that severe article of war, to which he thus rendered himself obnoxious, was never enforced against him. Nor, so far as any of the crew ever knew, did the captain even venture to reprimand him for his temerity. It has been said that Mad Jack himself was a lover of strong drink. So he was. But here we only see the virtue of being placed in a station constantly demanding a cool head and steady nerves, and the misfortune of filling a post that does not at all times demand these qualities. So exact and methodical in most things was the discipline of the frigate, that, to a certain extent, Captain Claret was exempted from personal interposition in many of its current events, and thereby, perhaps, was he lulled into security, under the enticing lee of his decanter. But as for Mad Jack, he must stand his regular watches, and pace the quarter-deck at night, and keep a sharp eye to windward. Hence, at sea, Mad Jack tried to make a point of keeping sober, though in very fine weather he was sometimes betrayed into a glass too many. But with Cape Horn before him, he took the temperance pledge outright, till that perilous promontory should be far astern. The leading incident of the gale irresistibly invites the question, are there incompetent officers in the American Navy? That is, incompetent to the due performance of whatever duties may devolve upon them. But in that gallant marine, which, during the late war, gained so much of what is called glory, can there possibly be today incompetent officers? As in the camp ashore, so on the quarter-deck at sea, the trumpets of one victory drown the muffled drums of 1,000 defeats. And, in degree, this holds true of those events of war which are neuter in their character, neither making renown nor disgrace. Besides, as a long array of ciphers, led by but one solitary numeral, swell, by mere force of aggregation, into an immense arithmetical sum, even so, in some brilliant actions, do a crowd of officers, each inefficient in himself, aggregate renown when banded together, and led by a numeral Nelson or a Wellington. And the renown of such heroes, by outliving themselves, descends as a heritage to their subordinate survivors. One large brain and one large heart have virtue sufficient to magnetize a whole fleet or an army. And if all the men who, since the beginning of the world, have mainly contributed to the warlike successes or reverses of nations, were now mustered together, we should be amazed to behold but a handful of heroes. For there is no heroism in merely running in and out a gun at a porthole, enveloped in smoke or vapor, or in firing off muskets in platoons at the word of command. This kind of merely manual valor is often born of trepidation at the heart. There may be men individually craven, who, united, may display even temerity. Yet it would be false to deny that, in some instances, the lowest privates have acquitted themselves with even more gallantry than their commodores. True heroism is not in the hand, but in the heart and the head. But are there incompetent officers in the gallant American Navy? For an American, the question is of no grateful cast. White Jacket must again evade it by referring to an historical fact in the history of a kindred marine, which, from its long standing and magnitude, furnishes many more examples of all kinds than our own. And this is the only reason why it is ever referred to in this narrative. I thank God I am free from all national invidiousness. It is indirectly on record in the books of the English Admiralty that in the year 1808, after the death of Lord Nelson, when Lord Collingwood commanded on the Mediterranean station, and his broken health induced him to solicit a furlough, that out of a list of upward of 100 admirals, not a single officer was found who was deemed qualified to relieve the applicant with credit to the country. This fact Collingwood sealed with his life. For, hopeless of being recalled, he shortly after died, worn out at his post. Now, if this was the case in so renowned a marine as England's, what must be inferred with respect to our own? But herein no special disgrace is involved. For the truth is, that to be an accomplished and skillful naval generalissimo needs natural capabilities of an uncommon order. Still more, it may safely be asserted, that worthily to command even a frigate requires a degree of natural heroism, talent, judgment, and integrity that is denied to mediocrity. Yet these qualifications are not only required, but demanded, and no one has a right to be a naval captain unless he possesses them. Regarding lieutenants, there are not a few selvages and paper jacks in the American Navy. Many commodores know that they have seldom taken a line-of-battle ship to sea, without feeling more or less nervousness when some of the lieutenants have the deck at night. According to the last Navy Register, 1849, there are now 68 captains in the American Navy, collectively drawing about $300,000 annually from the public treasury. Also, 297 commanders, drawing about $200,000, and 377 lieutenants, drawing about $500,000, and 451 midshipmen, including past midshipmen, also drawing nearly $500,000. Considering the known facts that some of these officers are seldom or never sent to sea, owing to the Navy Department being well aware of their inefficiency, that others are detailed for pen and ink work at observatories and solvers of logarithms in the Coast Survey, while the really meritorious officers who are accomplished practical seamen are known to be sent from ship to ship with but small interval of a furlough. Considering all this, it is not too much to say that no small portion of the $1.5 million of money above mentioned is annually paid to national pensioners in disguise, who live on the Navy without serving it. Nothing like this can be even insinuated against the forward officers, boatswains, gunners, etc., nor against the petty officers, captains of the tops, etc., nor against the able seamen in the Navy. For if any of these are found wanting, they are forthwith disrated or discharged. True, all experience teaches that, whenever there is a great national establishment, employing large numbers of officials, the public must be reconciled to support many incompetent men. For such is the favoritism and nepotism always prevailing in the purlieus of these establishments, that some incompetent persons are always admitted, to the exclusion of many of the worthy. Nevertheless, in a country like ours, boasting of the political equality of all social conditions, it is a great reproach that such a thing as a common seaman rising to the rank of a commissioned officer in our Navy is nowadays almost unheard of. Yet, in former times, when officers have so risen to rank, they have generally proved of signal usefulness in the service, and sometimes have reflected solid honor upon the country. Instances in point might be mentioned. Is it not well to have our institutions of a peace? Any American landsman may hope to become President of the Union, Commodore of our squadron of states, and every American sailor should be placed in such a position that he might freely aspire to command a squadron of frigates. Chapter 28. Edging Away. Right before the wind. Aye, blow, blow, ye breezes. So long as ye stay fair, and we are homeward bound, what care the jolly crew? It is worth mentioning here that, in 19 cases out of 20, a passage from the Pacific round the Cape is almost sure to be much shorter, and attended with less hardship, than a passage undertaken from the Atlantic. The reason is that the gales are mostly from the westward, also the currents. But, after all, going before the wind in a frigate in such a tempest has its annoyances and drawbacks, as well as many other blessings. The disproportionate weight of metal upon the spar and gun decks induces a violent rolling, unknown to merchant ships. We rolled and rolled on our way, like the world in its orbit, shipping green seas on both sides, until the old frigate dipped and went into it like a diving bell. The hatchways of some armed vessels are but poorly secured in bad weather. This was peculiarly the ease with those of the Neversink. They were merely spread over with an old tarpaulin, cracked and rent in every direction. In fair weather, the ship's company messed on the gun deck, but as this was now flooded almost continually, we were obliged to take our meals upon the berth deck, the next one below. One day, the messes of the starboard watch were seated here at dinner, forming little groups, 12 or 15 men in each, reclining about the beef kids and their pots and pans, when all of a sudden the ship was seized with such a paroxysm of rolling that, in a single instant, everything on the berth deck, pots, kids, sailors, pieces of beef, bread bags, clothes bags, and barges, were tossed indiscriminately from side to side. It was impossible to stay oneself. There was nothing but the bare deck to cling to, which was slippery with the contents of the kids, and heaving under us as if there were a volcano in the frigate's hold. While we were yet sliding in uproarious crowds, all seated, the windows of the deck opened, and floods of brine descended, simultaneously with a violent lee roll. The shower was hailed by the reckless tars with a hurricane of yells, although, for an instant, I really imagined we were about being swamped in the sea. Such volumes of water came cascading down. A day or two after, we had made sufficient easting to stand to the northward, which we did with the wind astern, thus fairly turning the corner without abating our rate of progress. Though we had seen no land since leaving Callao, Cape Horn was said to be somewhere to the west of us, and though there was no positive evidence of the fact, the weather encountered might be accounted pretty good presumptive proof. The land near Cape Horn, however, is well worth seeing, especially Staten Land. Upon one occasion, the ship in which I then happened to be sailing drew near this place from the northward, with a fair, free wind, blowing steadily, through a bright translucent clay, whose air was almost musical with the clear, glittering cold. On our starboard beam, like a pile of glaciers in Switzerland, lay this Staten Land, gleaming in snow-white barrenness and solitude. Unnumbered white albatross were skimming the sea nearby, and clouds of smaller white wings fell through the air like snowflakes. High, towering in their own turbaned snows, the far inland pinnacles loomed up, like the border of some other world. Flashing walls and crystal battlements, like the diamond watchtowers along heaven's furthest frontier. After leaving the latitude of the Cape, we had several storms of snow. One night a considerable quantity laid upon the decks, and some of the sailors enjoyed the juvenile diversion of snowballing. Woe unto the middy who that night went forward of the booms. Such a target for snowballs. The throwers could never be known. By some curious sleight in hurling the missiles, they seemed to be thrown on board by some hoydenish sea nymphs outside the frigate. At daybreak Midshipman Pert went below to the surgeon with an alarming wound, gallantly received in discharging his perilous duty on the forecastle. The officer of the deck had sent him on an errand, to tell the boatswain that he was wanted in the captain's cabin. While in the very act of performing the exploit of delivering the message, Mr. Pert was struck on the nose with a snowball of wondrous compactness. Upon being informed of the disaster, the rogues expressed the liveliest sympathy. Pert was no favorite. After one of these storms, it was a curious sight to see the men relieving the uppermost deck of its load of snow. It became the duty of the captain of each gun to keep his own station clean. Accordingly, with an old broom or squilgee, he proceeded to business, often quarreling with his next-door neighbors about their scraping their snow on his premises. It was like Broadway in winter, the morning after a storm, when rival shop boys are at work cleaning the sidewalk. Now and then, by way of variety, we had a fall of hailstones so big that sometimes we found ourselves dodging them. The Commodore had a Polynesian servant on board, whose services he had engaged at the Society Islands. Unlike his countrymen, Wu was of a sedate, earnest, and philosophic temperament. Having never been outside of the tropics before, he found many phenomena off Cape Horn, which absorbed his attention and set him, like other philosophers, to feign theories corresponding to the marvels he beheld. At the first snow, when he saw the deck covered all over with a white powder, as it were, he expanded his eyes into stewpans. But upon examining the strange substance, he decided that this must be a species of superfine flour, such as was compounded into his master's duffs and other dainties. In vain did an experienced natural philosopher belonging to the foretop maintain before his face that in this hypothesis Wu was mistaken. Wu's opinion remained unchanged for some time. As for the hailstones, they transported him. He went about with a bucket, making collections and receiving contributions, for the purpose of carrying them home to his sweethearts for glass beads. But having put his bucket away and returning to it again and finding nothing but a little water, he accused the bystanders of stealing his precious stones. This suggests another story concerning him. The first time he was given a piece of duff to eat, he was observed to pick out very carefully every raisin and throw it away with a gesture indicative of the highest disgust. It turned out that he had taken the raisins for bugs. In our man of war, this semi-savage, wandering about the gun deck in his barbaric robe, seemed a being from some other sphere. His tastes were our abominations, ours his. Our creed he rejected, his we. We thought him a loon, he fancied us fools. Had the case been reversed, had we been Polynesians and he an American, our mutual opinion of each other would still have remained the same. A fact proving that neither was wrong, but both right. Chapter 29. The Night Watches. Though leaving the Cape behind us, the severe cold still continued, and one of its worst consequences was the almost incurable drowsiness induced thereby during the long night watches. All along the decks, huddled between the guns, stretched out on the carronade slides, and in every accessible nook and corner, you would see the sailors wrapped in their monkey jackets, in a state of half-conscious torpidity, lying still and freezing alive, without the power to rise and shake themselves. "Up, up, you lazy dogs!" our good-natured third lieutenant, a Virginian, would cry, rapping them with his speaking trumpet. "Get up and stir about." But in vain. They would rise for an instant, and as soon as his back was turned, down they would drop, as if shot through the heart. Often I have lain thus when the fact that if I laid much longer I would actually freeze to death, would come over me with such overpowering force as to break the icy spell, and starting to my feet, I would endeavor to go through the combined manual and pedal exercise to restore the circulation. The first fling of my benumbed arm generally struck me in the face, instead of smiting my chest, its true destination. But in these cases one's muscles have their own way. In exercising my other extremities, I was obliged to hold on to something and leap with both feet, for my limbs seemed as destitute of joints as a pair of canvas pants spread to dry and frozen stiff. When an order was given to haul the braces, which required the strength of the entire watch, some 200 men, a spectator would have supposed that all hands had received a stroke of the palsy. Roused from their state of enchantment, they came halting and limping across the decks, falling against each other, and, for a few moments, almost unable to handle the ropes. The slightest exertion seemed intolerable, and frequently a body of 80 or 100 men summoned to brace the main yard would hang over the rope for several minutes, waiting for some active fellow to pick it up and put it into their hands. Even then, it was some time before they were able to do anything. They made all the motions usual in hauling a rope, but it was a long time before the yard budged an inch. It was to no purpose that the officers swore at them, or sent the midshipmen among them to find out who those horse marines and sogers were. The sailors were so enveloped in monkey jackets that in the dark night there was no telling one from the other. "Here you, sir!" cries little Mr. Pert, eagerly catching hold of the skirts of an old sea-dog and trying to turn him round so as to peer under his tarpaulin. "Who are you, sir? What's your name?" "Find out, milk and water," was the impertinent rejoinder. "Blast you, you old rascal! I'll have you licked for that. Tell me his name, some of you," turning round to the bystanders. "Gammon!" cries a voice at a distance. "Hang me, but I know you, sir. And here's at you." And so saying, Mr. Pert drops the impenetrable unknown and makes into the crowd after the bodiless voice. But the attempt to find an owner for that voice is quite as idle as the effort to discover the contents of the monkey jacket. And here sorrowful mention must be made of something which, during this state of affairs, most sorely afflicted me. Most monkey jackets are of a dark hue. Mine, as I have 50 times repeated, and say again, was white. And thus, in those long, dark nights, when it was my quarter watch on deck, and not in the top, and others went skulking and sogering about the decks, secure from detection, their identity undiscoverable, my own hapless jacket forever proclaimed the name of its wearer. It gave me many a hard job, which otherwise I should have escaped. When an officer wanted a man for any particular duty, running aloft, say, to communicate some slight order to the captains of the tops, how easy, in that mob of incognitos, to individualize that white jacket, and dispatch him on the errand. Then, it would never do for me to hang back when the ropes were being pulled. Indeed, upon all these occasions, such alacrity and cheerfulness was I obliged to display, that I was frequently held up as an illustrious example of activity, which the rest were called upon to emulate. Pull, pull, you lazy lubbers! Look at White Jacket there! Pull like him! Oh, how I execrated my luckless garment! How often I scoured the deck with it to give it a tawny hue! How often I supplicated the inexorable Brush, captain of the paint-room, for just one brushful of his invaluable pigment. Frequently I meditated giving it a toss overboard, but I had not the resolution. Jacketless at sea, jacketless so near Cape Horn. The thought was unendurable, and, at least, my garment was a jacket in name if not in utility. At length I essayed a swap. "Here, Bob," said I, assuming all possible suavity, and accosting a messmate with a sort of diplomatic assumption of superiority. "Suppose I was ready to part with this Grego of mine, and take yours in exchange, what would you give me to boot?" "Give you to boot?" he exclaimed with horror. "I wouldn't take your infernal jacket for a gift." How I hailed every snow squall! For then, blessings on them! Many of the men became white jackets along with myself, and, powdered with the flakes, we all looked like millers. We had 6 lieutenants, all of whom, with the exception of the first lieutenant, by turns headed the watches. 3 of these officers, including Mad Jack, were strict disciplinarians, and never permitted us to lay down on deck during the night. And, to tell the truth, though it caused much growling, it was far better for our health to be thus kept on our feet. So promenading was all the vogue. For some of us, however, it was like pacing in a dungeon. For, as we had to keep at our stations, some at the halyards, some at the braces, and elsewhere, and were not allowed to stroll about indefinitely and fairly take the measure of the ship's entire keel, we were fain to confine ourselves to the space of a very few feet. But the worst of this was soon over. The suddenness of the change in the temperature consequent on leaving Cape Horn, and steering to the northward with a 10-knot breeze, is a noteworthy thing. Today you are assailed by a blast that seems to have edged itself on icebergs. But in a little more than a week your jacket may be superfluous. One word more about Cape Horn and we have done with it. Years hence, when a ship canal shall have penetrated the Isthmus of Darien, and the traveler be taking his seat in the ears at Cape Cod for Astoria, it will be held a thing almost incredible that, for so long a period, vessels bound to the northwest coast from New York should, by going round Cape Horn, have lengthened their voyages some thousands of miles. In those unenlightened days, I quote, in advance, the language of some future philosopher, entire years were frequently consumed in making the voyage to and from the Spice Islands, the present fashionable watering place of the beau monde of Oregon. Such must be our national progress. Why, sir, that boy of yours will, one of these days, be sending your grandson to the salubrious city of Jeddo to spend his summer vacations. Chapter 30. A peep through a porthole at the subterranean parts of a man-o' war. While now running rapidly away from the bitter coast of Patagonia, battling with the night watches, still cold as best we may, come under the lee of my white jacket, reader, while I tell of the less painful sights to be seen in a frigate. A hint has already been conveyed concerning the subterranean depths of the Neversink's hold. But there is no time here to speak of the spirit room, a cellar down in the afterhold, where the sailor's grog is kept, nor of the cable tiers, where the great hawsers and chains are piled, as you see them at a large ship chandler's on shore, nor of the grocer's vaults, where tierces of sugar, molasses, vinegar, rice, and flour are snugly stowed, nor of the sailroom, full as a sailmaker's loft ashore, piled up with great topsails and topgallant sails, all ready folded in their places, like so many white vests in a gentleman's wardrobe, nor of the copper and copper-fastened magazine, closely packed with kegs of powder, great gun and small-arm cartridges, nor of the immense shot lockers or subterranean arsenals, full as a bushel of apples with 24-pound balls, nor of the bread-room, a large apartment, tinned all round within to keep out the mice, where the hard biscuit destined for the consumption of 500 men on a long voyage is stowed away by the cubic yard, nor of the vast iron tanks for fresh water in the hold, like the reservoir lakes at Fairmount in Philadelphia, nor of the paint-room, where the kegs of white lead and casks of linseed oil and all sorts of pots and brushes are kept, nor of the armorer's smithy, where the ship's forges and anvils may be heard ringing at times. I say I have no time to speak of these things and many more places of note. But there is one very extensive warehouse among the rest that needs special mention, the ship's yeoman's storeroom. In the Neversink it was down in the ship's basement, beneath the berth deck, and you went to it by way of the forepassage, a very dim, devious corridor indeed. Entering, say at noonday, you find yourself in a gloomy apartment, lit by a solitary lamp. On one side are shelves, filled with balls of marline, rattlin stuff, seizing stuff, spun yarn, and numerous twines of assorted sizes. In another direction you see large cases containing heaps of articles, reminding one of a shoemaker's furnishing store, wooden serving mallets, fids, toggles, and heavers, iron prickers and marling spikes. In a third quarter you see a sort of hardware shop, shelves piled with all manner of hooks, bolts, nails, screws, and thimbles, and in still another direction you see a blockmaker's store, heaped up with lignum vitae sheaves and wheels. Through low arches in the bulkhead beyond, you peep in upon distant vaults and catacombs, obscurely lighted in the far end, and showing immense coils of new ropes and other bulky articles, stowed in tiers, all savoring of tar. But by far the most curious department of these mysterious storerooms is the armory, where the spikes, cutlasses, pistols, and belts, forming the arms of the boarders in time of action, are hung against the walls and suspended in thick rows from the beams overhead. Here, too, are to be seen scores of Colt's patent revolvers, which, though furnished with but one tube, multiply the fatal bullets as the naval cat-o'-nine-tails, with a cannibal cruelty, in one blow 9 times multiplies a culprit's lashes, so that when a sailor is ordered 12 lashes, the sentence should read 108. All these arms are kept in the brightest order, wearing a fine polish, and may truly be said to reflect credit on the yeoman and his mates. Among the lower grade of officers in a man-of-war, that of yeoman is not the least important. His responsibilities are denoted by his pay, while the petty officers, quarter-gunners, captains of the tops, and others receive but $15 and $18 a month. But little more than a mere able seaman. The yeoman in an American line-of-battle ship receives $40, and in a frigate $35 per month. He is accountable for all the articles under his charge, and on no account must deliver a yard of twine or a 10-penny nail to the boatswain or carpenter, unless shown a written requisition and order from the senior lieutenant. The yeoman is to be found burrowing in his underground storerooms all the day long, in readiness to serve licensed customers. But in the counter, behind which he usually stands, there is no place for a till to drop the shillings in, which takes away not a little from the most agreeable part of a storekeeper's duties. Nor, among the musty, old account books in his desk, where he registers all expenditures of his stuffs, is there any cash or checkbook. The yeoman of the Neversink was a somewhat odd specimen of a troglodyte. He was a little old man, round-shouldered, bald-headed, with great goggle eyes, looking through portentous round spectacles, which he called his barnacles. He was imbued with a wonderful zeal for the naval service, and seemed to think that, in keeping his pistols and cutlasses free from rust, he preserved the national honor untarnished. After general quarters, it was amusing to watch his anxious air as the various petty officers restored to him the arms used at the martial exercises of the crew. As successive bundles would be deposited on his counter, he would count over the pistols and cutlasses, like an old housekeeper telling over her silver forks and spoons in a pantry before retiring for the night. And often, with a sort of dark lantern in his hand, he might be seen poking into his furthest vaults and cellars, and counting over his great coils of ropes, as if they were all jolly puncheons of old port and Madeira. By reason of his incessant watchfulness and unaccountable bachelor oddities, it was very difficult for him to retain in his employment the various sailors who, from time to time, were billeted with him to do the duty of subalterns. In particular, he was always desirous of having at least one steady, faultless young man, of a literary taste, to keep an eye to his account books, and swab out the armory every morning. It was an odious business this, to be immured all day in such a bottomless hole, among tarry old ropes and villainous guns and pistols. It was with peculiar dread that I one day noticed the goggle eyes of old Revolver, as they called him, fastened upon me with a fatal glance of good-will and approbation. He had somehow heard of my being a very learned person, who could both read and write with extraordinary facility, and moreover that I was a rather reserved youth, who kept his modest, unassuming merits in the background. But though, from the keen sense of my situation as a man-of-war's man, all this about my keeping myself in the background was true enough, yet I had no idea of hiding my diffident merits underground. I became alarmed at the old yeoman's goggling glances, lest he should drag me down into tarry perdition in his hideous storerooms. But this fate was providentially averted, owing to mysterious causes which I never could fathom. Chapter 31. The Gunner Under Hatches. Among such a crowd of marked characters as were to be met with on board our frigate, many of whom moved in mysterious circles beneath the lowermost deck, and at long intervals flitted into sight like apparitions, and disappeared again for whole weeks together, there were some who inordinately excited my curiosity, and whose names, callings, and precise abodes I industriously sought out, in order to learn something satisfactory concerning them. While engaged in these inquiries, often fruitless or but partially gratified, I could not but regret that there was no public printed directory for the Neversink, such as they have in large towns, containing an alphabetic list of all the crew, and where they might be found. Also, in losing myself in some remote, dark corner of the bowels of the frigate, in the vicinity of the various storerooms, shops, and warehouses, I much lamented that no enterprising tar had yet thought of compiling a handbook of the Neversink, so that the tourist might have a reliable guide. Indeed, there were several parts of the ship under hatches shrouded in mystery, and completely inaccessible to the sailor. Wondrous old doors, barred and bolted in dingy bulkheads, must have opened into regions full of interest to a successful explorer. They looked like the gloomy entrances to family vaults of buried dead, and when I chanced to see some unknown functionary insert his key and enter these inexplicable apartments with a battle lantern, as if on solemn official business, I almost quaked to dive in with him and satisfy myself whether these vaults indeed contained the moldering relics of bygone old commodores and post-captains. But the habitations of the living commodore and captain, their spacious and curtained cabins, were themselves almost as sealed volumes, and I passed them in hopeless wonderment, like a peasant before a prince's palace. Night and day armed sentries guarded their sacred portals, cutlass in hand, and had I dared to cross their path, I would infallibly have been cut down as if in battle. Thus, though for a period of more than a year I was an inmate of this floating box of live oak, yet there were numberless things in it that, to the last, remained wrapped in obscurity, or concerning which I could only lose myself in vague speculations. I was as a Roman Jew of the Middle Ages, confined to the Jews' quarter of the town, and forbidden to stray beyond my limits. Or I was as a modern traveler in the same famous city, forced to quit it at last without gaining ingress to the most mysterious haunts, the innermost shrine of the Pope, and the dungeons and cells of the Inquisition. But among all the persons and things on board that puzzled me, and filled me most with strange emotions of doubt, misgivings, and mystery, was the gunner. A short, square, grim man, his hair and beard grizzled and singed, as if with gunpowder. His skin was of a flecky brown, like the stained barrel of a fowling piece, and his hollow eyes burned in his head like blue lights. He it was who had access to many of those mysterious vaults I have spoken of. Often he might be seen groping his way into them, followed by his subalterns, the old quarter-gunners, as if intent upon laying a train of powder to blow up the ship. I remembered Guy Fawkes and the Parliament House, and made earnest inquiry whether this gunner was a Roman Catholic. I felt relieved when informed that he was not. A little circumstance which one of his mates once told me heightened the gloomy interest with which I regarded his chief. He told me that, at periodical intervals, his master the gunner, accompanied by his phalanx, entered into the great magazine under the gunroom, of which he had sole custody and kept the key, nearly as big as the key of the Bastille, and provided with lanterns, something like Sir Humphrey Davy's safety lamp for coal mines, proceeded to turn, end for end, all the kegs of powder and packages of cartridges stored in this innermost explosive vault, lined throughout with sheets of copper. In the vestibule of the magazine, against the paneling, were several pegs for slippers, and, before penetrating further than that vestibule, every man of the gunner's gang silently removed his shoes, for fear that the nails in their heels might possibly create a spark, by striking against the coppered floor within. Then, with slippered feet and with hushed whispers, they stole into the heart of the place. This turning of the powder was to preserve its inflammability. And surely it was a business full of direful interest, to be buried so deep below the sun, handling whole barrels of powder, any one of which, touched by the smallest spark, was powerful enough to blow up a whole street of warehouses. The gunner went by the name of Old Combustibles, though I thought this an undignified name for so momentous a personage, who had all our lives in his hand. While we lay in Callao, we received from shore several barrels of powder. So soon as the launch came alongside with them, orders were given to extinguish all lights and all fires in the ship, and the master-at-arms and his corporals inspected every deck to see that this order was obeyed. A very prudent precaution, no doubt, but not observed at all in the Turkish navy. The Turkish sailors will sit on their gun carriages, tranquilly smoking, while kegs of powder are being rolled under their ignited pipe bowls. This shows the great comfort there is in the doctrine of these fatalists, and how such a doctrine, in some things at least, relieves men from nervous anxieties. But we all are fatalists at bottom. Nor need we so much marvel at the heroism of that army officer, who challenged his personal foe to bestride a barrel of powder with him, the match to be placed between them, and be blown up in good company, for it is pretty certain that the whole earth itself is a vast hogshead, full of inflammable materials, and which we are always bestriding. At the same time, that all good Christians believe that at any minute the last day may come and the terrible combustion of the entire planet ensue. As if impressed with a befitting sense of the awfulness of his calling, our gunner always wore a fixed expression of solemnity, which was heightened by his grizzled hair and beard. But what imparted such a sinister look to him, and what wrought so upon my imagination concerning this man, was a frightful scar crossing his left cheek and forehead. He had been almost mortally wounded, they said, with a saber cut, during a frigate engagement in the last war with Britain. He was the most methodical, exact, and punctual of all the forward officers. Among his other duties, it pertained to him, while in harbor, to see that at a certain hour in the evening one of the great guns was discharged from the forecastle, a ceremony only observed in a flagship. And always at the precise moment you might behold him blowing his match, then applying it, and with that booming thunder in his ear, and the smell of the powder in his hair, he retired to his hammock for the night. What dreams he must have had! The same precision was observed when ordered to fire a gun to bring to some ship at sea. For, true to their name and preserving its applicability, even in times of peace, all men of war are great bullies on the high seas. They domineer over the poor merchantmen, and with a hissing hot ball sent bowling across the ocean, compel them to stop their headway at pleasure. It was enough to make you a man of method for life, to see the gunner superintending his subalterns, when preparing the main-deck batteries for a great national salute. While lying in harbor, intelligence reached us of the lamentable casualty that befell certain high officers of state, including the acting secretary of the Navy himself, some other member of the President's cabinet, a commodore, and others, all engaged in experimenting upon a newfangled engine of war. At the same time with the receipt of this sad news, orders arrived to fire minute guns for the deceased head of the Naval Department. Upon this occasion the gunner was more than usually ceremonious, in seeing that the long 24s were thoroughly loaded and rammed down, and then accurately marked with chalk so as to be discharged in undeviating rotation, first from the larboard side, and then from the starboard. But as my ears hummed, and all my bones danced in me with the reverberating din, and my eyes and nostrils were almost suffocated with the smoke, and when I saw this grim old gunner firing away so solemnly, I thought it a strange mode of honoring a man's memory who had himself been slaughtered by a cannon. Only the smoke that, after rolling in at the portholes, rapidly drifted away to leeward, and was lost to view, seemed truly emblematical touching the personage thus honored, since that great non-combatant, the Bible, assures us that our life is but a vapor, that quickly passeth away. Chapter 32. A Dish of Dunderfunk. In men of war, the space on the uppermost deck, round about the mainmast, is the police office, courthouse, and yard of execution, where all charges are lodged, causes tried, and punishment administered. In frigate phrase, to be brought up to the mast is equivalent to being presented before the grand jury, to see whether a true bill will be found against you. From the merciless, inquisitorial baiting, which sailors, charged with offenses, too often experience at the mast, that vicinity is usually known among them as the bullring. The mainmast, moreover, is the only place where the sailor can hold formal communication with the captain and officers. If anyone has been robbed, if anyone has been evilly entreated, if anyone's character has been defamed, if anyone has a request to present, if anyone has aught important for the executive of the ship to know, straight to the mainmast he repairs, and stands there, generally with his hat off, waiting the pleasure of the officer of the deck to advance and communicate with him. Often, the most ludicrous scenes occur, and the most comical complaints are made. One clear, cold morning, while we were yet running away from the Cape, a raw-boned, crack-pated down-easter, belonging to the waist, made his appearance at the mast, dolefully exhibiting a blackened tin pan, bearing a few crusty traces of some sort of a sea pie, which had been cooked in it. "Well, sir, what now?" said the lieutenant of the deck, advancing. "They stole it, sir. All my nice dunderfunk, sir." "They did, sir," whined the down-easter, ruefully holding up his pan. "Stole your dunderfunk? What's that?" "Dunderfunk, sir. Dunderfunk. A cruel nice dish as ever man put into him." "Speak out, sir. What's the matter?" "My dunderfunk, sir. As elegant a dish of dunderfunk as you ever see, sir. They stole it, sir." "Go forward, you rascal!" cried the lieutenant, in a towering rage. "Or else stop your whining. Tell me, what's the matter?" "Why, sir, them air two fellows, Dobbs and Hodnos, stole my dunderfunk." "Once more, sir, I ask what that dundeldunk is? Speak, as cruel and nice. Be off, sir. Sheer." And muttering something about non compos mentis, the lieutenant stalked away, while the down-easter beat a melancholy retreat, holding up his pan like a tambourine, and making dolorous music on it as he went. "Where are you going with that tear in your eye, like a traveling rat?" cried a topman. "Oh, he's going home to down east," said another. "So far eastward, you know, shippy, that they have to pry up the sun with a handspike. To make this anecdote plainer, be it said that, at sea, the monotonous round of salt beef and pork at the messes of the sailors, where but very few of the varieties of the season are to be found, induces them to adopt many contrivances in order to diversify their meals. Hence the various sea rolls, made dishes, and Mediterranean pies, well known by men of war's men scouse, lobscouse, soft-tack, soft-tommy, skilligalee, burgoo, doughboys, lobdominion, dog's body, and lastly, and least known, dunderfunk, all of which come under the general denomination of manavalins. Dunderfunk is made of hard biscuit, hashed and pounded, mixed with beef fat, molasses, and water, and baked brown in a pan. And to those who are beyond all reach of shore delicacies, this dunderfunk, in the feeling language of the down-easter, is certainly a cruel nice dish. Now the only way that a sailor, after preparing his dunderfunk, could get it cooked on board the Neversink, was by slyly going to Old Coffee, the ship's cook, and bribing him to put it into his oven. And as some such dishes or other are well known to be all the time in the oven, a set of unprincipled gourmands are constantly on the lookout for the chance of stealing them. Generally, 2 or 3 league together, and while one engages Old Coffee in some interesting conversation touching his wife and family at home, another snatches the first thing he can lay hands on in the oven, and rapidly passes it to the third man, who at his earliest leisure disappears with it. In this manner had the down-easter lost his precious pie, and afterward found the empty pan knocking about the forecastle. Chapter 33. A Flogging. If you begin the day with a laugh, you may, nevertheless, end it with a sob and a sigh. Among the many who were exceedingly diverted with the scene between the down-easter and the lieutenant, none laughed more heartily than John, Peter, Mark, and Antone, for sailors of the starboard watch. The same evening these four found themselves prisoners in the brig, with a sentry standing over them. They were charged with violating a well-known law of the ship, having been engaged in one of those tangled general fights sometimes occurring among sailors. They had nothing to anticipate but a flogging, at the captain's pleasure. Toward evening of the next day, they were startled by the dread summons of the boatswain and his mates at the principal hatchway, a summons that ever sends a shudder through every manly heart in a frigate. All hands witness punishment, ahoy! The hoarseness of the cry, its unrelenting prolongation, its being caught up at different points, and sent through the lowermost depths of the ship. All this produces a most dismal effect upon every heart not calloused by long habituation to it. However much you may desire to absent yourself from the scene that ensues, yet behold it you must, or, at least, stand near it you must, for the regulations enjoin the attendance of the entire ship's company, from the corpulent captain himself to the smallest boy who strikes the bell. All hands witness punishment, ahoy! To the sensitive seaman that summons sounds like a doom. He knows that the same law which impels it, the same law by which the culprits of the day must suffer, that by that very law he also is liable at any time to be judged and condemned, and the inevitableness of his own presence at the scene, the strong arm that drags him in view of the scourge, and holds him there till all is over, forcing upon his loathing eye and soul the sufferings and groans of men who have familiarly consorted with him, eaten with him, battled out watches with him, men of his own type and badge. All this conveys a terrible hint of the omnipotent authority under which he lives. Indeed, to such a man the naval summons to witness punishment carries a thrill, somewhat akin to what we may impute to the quick and the dead, when they shall hear the last trump, that is to bid them all arise in their ranks, and behold the final penalties inflicted upon the sinners of our race. But it must not be imagined that to all men of war's men this summons conveys such poignant emotions. But it is hard to decide whether one should be glad or sad that this is not the case, whether it is grateful to know that so much pain is avoided, or whether it is far sadder to think that, either from constitutional hard-heartedness or the multiplied searings of habit, hundreds of men of war's men have been made proof against the sense of degradation, pity, and shame. As if in sympathy with the scene to be enacted, the sun, which the day previous had merrily flashed upon the tin pan of the disconsolate Down Easter, was now setting over the dreary waters, veiling itself in vapors. The wind blew hoarsely in the cordage. The seas broke heavily against the bows, and the frigate, staggering under whole topsails, strained as in agony on her way. All hands witnessed punishment, ahoy! At the summons the crew crowded round the mainmast. Multitudes eager to obtain a good place on the booms, to overlook the scene. Many laughing and chatting, others canvassing the case of the culprits. Some maintaining sad, anxious countenances, or carrying a suppressed indignation in their eyes. A few purposely keeping behind to avoid looking on. In short, among 500 men, there was every possible shade of character. All the officers, midshipmen included, stood together in a group on the starboard side of the mainmast. The first lieutenant in advance, and the surgeon, whose special duty it is to be present at such times, standing close by his side. Presently the captain came forward from his cabin, and stood in the center of this solemn group, with a small paper in his hand. That paper was the daily report of offenses, regularly laid upon his table every morning or evening, like the day's journal placed by a bachelor's napkin at breakfast. "Master-at-arms, bring up the prisoners," he said. A few moments elapsed, during which the captain, now clothed in his most dreadful attributes, fixed his eyes severely upon the crew, when suddenly a lane formed through the crowd of seamen, and the prisoners advanced, the master-at-arms, rattan in hand on one side, and an armed marine on the other, and took up their stations at the mast. "You John, you Peter, you Mark, you Antone," said the captain, "were yesterday found fighting on the gun-deck. Have you anything to say?" Mark and Antone, two steady, middle-aged men, whom I had often admired for their sobriety, replied that they did not strike the first blow, that they had submitted to much before they had yielded to their passions. But as they acknowledged that they had at last defended themselves, their excuse was overruled. John, a brutal bully who, it seems, was the real author of the disturbance, was about entering into a long extenuation, when he was cut short by being made to confess, irrespective of circumstances, that he had been in the fray. Peter, a handsome lad about 19 years old, belonging to the mizentop, looked pale and tremulous. He was a great favorite in his part of the ship, and especially in his own mess, principally composed of lads of his own age. That morning 2 of his young messmates had gone to his bag, taken out his best clothes, and, obtaining the permission of the marine sentry at the brig, had handed them to him to be put on against being summoned to the mast. This was done to propitiate the captain, as most captains love to see a tidy sailor. But it would not do. To all his supplications the captain turned a deaf ear. Peter declared that he had been struck twice before he had returned a blow. "No matter," said the captain. "You struck at last, instead of reporting the case to an officer. I allow no man to fight on board here but myself. I do the fighting. Now, men," he added, "you all admit the charge, you know the penalty. Strip, quartermasters, are the gratings rigged?" The gratings are square frames of barred woodwork, sometimes placed over the hatchways. One of these squares was now laid on the deck, close to the ship's bulwarks, and while the remaining preparations were being made, the master-at-arms assisted the prisoners in removing their jackets and shirts. This done, their shirts were loosely thrown over their shoulders. At a sign from the captain, John, with a shameless leer, advanced and stood passively upon the grating, while the bare-headed old quartermaster, with gray hair streaming in the wind, bound his feet to the crossbars, and, stretching out his arms over his head, secured them to the hammock nettings above. He then retreated a little space, standing silent. Meanwhile, the boatswain stood solemnly on the other side, with a green bag in his hand, from which, taking 4 instruments of punishment, he gave one to each of his mates. For a fresh cat applied by a fresh hand is the ceremonious privilege accorded to every man-of-war culprit. At another sign from the captain, the master-at-arms, stepping up, removed the shirt from the prisoner. At this juncture a wave broke against the ship's side, and clashed the spray over his exposed back. But though the air was piercing cold, and the water drenched him, John stood still without a shudder. The captain's finger was now lifted, and the first boatswain's mate advanced, combing out the 9 tails of his cat with his hand, and then, sweeping them round his neck, brought them with the whole force of his body upon the mark. Again, and again, and again. And at every blow, higher and higher rose the long purple bars on the prisoner's back. But he only bowed over his head, and stood still. Meantime, some of the crew whispered among themselves in applause of their shipmate's nerve. But the greater part were breathlessly silent as the keen scourge hissed through the wintry air, and fell with a cutting, wiry sound upon the mark. 12 lashes being applied, the man was taken down, and went among the crew with a smile, saying, "And me. It's nothing when you're used to it. Who wants to fight?" The next was Antone the Portuguese. At every blow he surged from side to side, pouring out a torrent of involuntary blasphemies. Never before had he been heard to curse. When cut down, he went among the men, swearing to have the life of the captain. Of course, this was unheard by the officers. Mark, the 3rd prisoner, only cringed and coughed under his punishment. He had some pulmonary complaint. He was off duty for several days after the flogging, but this was partly to be imputed to his extreme mental misery. It was his first scourging, and he felt the insult more than the injury. He became silent and sullen for the rest of the cruise. The 4th and last was Peter, the mizentop lad. He had often boasted that he had never been degraded at the gangway. The day before his cheek had worn its usual red, but now no ghost was whiter. As he was being secured to the gratings, and the shudderings and creepings of his dazzlingly white back were revealed, he turned round his head imploringly, but his weeping entreaties and vows of contrition were of no avail. "I would not forgive God Almighty," cried the captain. The 4th boatswain's mate advanced, and at the first blow, the boy, shouting, "My God! Oh, my God!" writhed and leaped so as to displace the gratings, and scatter the 9 tails of the scourge all over his person. At the next blow he howled, leaped, and raged in unendurable torture. "What are you stopping for, boatswain's mate?" cried the captain. "Lay on!" And the whole dozen was applied. "I don't care what happens to me now," wept Peter, going among the crew with bloodshot eyes, as he put on his shirt. "I have been flogged once, and they may do it again, if they will. Let them look for me now." "Pipe down!" cried the captain, and the crew slowly dispersed. Let us have the charity to believe them, as we do, when some captains in the Navy say that the thing of all others most repulsive to them, in the routine of what they consider their duty, is the administration of corporal punishment upon the crew. For surely not to feel scarified to the quick at these scenes would argue a man but a beast. You see a human being, stripped like a slave, scourged worse than a hound. And for what? For things not essentially criminal but only made so by arbitrary laws. Chapter 34. Some of the evil effects of flogging. There are incidental considerations touching this matter of flogging, which exaggerate the evil into a great enormity. Many illustrations might be given, but let us be content with a few. One of the arguments advanced by officers of the Navy in favor of corporal punishment is this: it can be inflicted in a moment, it consumes no valuable time, and when the prisoner's shirt is put on, that is the last of it. Whereas, if another punishment were substituted, it would probably occasion a great waste of time and trouble, besides thereby begetting in the sailor an undue idea of his importance. Absurd, or worse than absurd, as it may appear, all this is true, and if you start from the same premises with these officers, you must admit that they advance an irresistible argument. But in accordance with this principle, captains in the Navy, to a certain extent, inflict the scourge, which is ever at hand, for nearly all degrees of transgression. In offenses not cognizable by a court-martial, little, if any, discrimination is shown. It is of a piece with the penal laws that prevailed in England some 60 years ago, when 160 different offenses were declared by the statute book to be capital, and the servant maid who but pilfered a watch was hung beside the murderer of a family. It is one of the most common punishments for very trivial offenses in the Navy to stop a seaman's grog for a day or a week. And as most seamen so cling to their grog, the loss of it is generally deemed by them a very serious penalty. You will sometimes hear them say, "I would rather have my wind stopped than my grog." But there are some sober seamen that would much rather draw the money for it, instead of the grog itself as provided by law, but they are too often deterred from this by the thought of receiving a scourging for some inconsiderable offense, as a substitute for the stopping of their spirits. This is a most serious obstacle to the cause of temperance in the Navy. But in many cases even the reluctant drawing of his grog cannot exempt a prudent seaman from ignominy. For besides the formal administering of the cat at the gangway for petty offenses, he is liable to the colt, or rope's end, a bit of ratlin stuff indiscriminately applied without stripping the victim at any time and in any part of the ship at the merest wink from the captain. By an express order of that officer, most boatswain's mates carry the colt coiled in their hats, in readiness to be administered at a minute's warning upon any offender. This was the custom in the Neversink, and until so recent a period as the administration of President Polk, when the historian Bancroft, Secretary of the Navy, officially interposed, it was an almost universal thing for the officers of the watch, at their own discretion, to inflict chastisement upon a sailor, and this, too, in the face of the ordinance restricting the power of flogging solely to captains and courts-martial. Nor was it a thing unknown for a lieutenant, in a sudden outburst of passion, perhaps inflamed by brandy, or smarting under the sense of being disliked or hated by the seamen, to order a whole watch of 250 men, at dead of night, to undergo the indignity of the colt. It is believed that, even at the present day, there are instances of commanders still violating the law by delegating the power of the colt to subordinates. At all events, it is certain that, almost to a man, the lieutenants in the Navy bitterly rail against the officiousness of Bancroft, in so materially abridging their usurped functions by snatching the colt from their hands. At the time, they predicted that this rash and most ill-judged interference of the Secretary would end in the breaking up of all discipline in the Navy. But it has not so proved. These officers now predict that, if the cat be abolished, the same unfulfilled prediction would be verified. Concerning the license with which many captains violate the express laws laid down by Congress for the government of the Navy, a glaring instance may be quoted. For upward of 40 years there has been on the American statute book a law prohibiting a captain from inflicting, on his own authority, more than 12 lashes at one time. If more are to be given, the sentence must be passed by a court-martial. Yet, for nearly half a century, this law has been frequently, and with almost perfect impunity, set at naught, though of late, through the exertions of Bancroft and others, it has been much better observed than formerly. Indeed, at the present day, it is generally respected. Still, while the Neversink was lying in a South American port, on the cruise now written of, the seamen belonging to another American frigate informed us that their captain sometimes inflicted, upon his own authority, 18 and 20 lashes. It is worth while to state that this frigate was vastly admired by the shore ladies for her wonderfully neat appearance. One of her forecastlemen told me that he had used up 3 jackknives, charged to him on the books of the purser, in scraping the belaying pins and the combings of the hatchways. It is singular that while the lieutenants of the watch in American men of war so long usurped the power of inflicting corporal punishment with the Colt, few or no similar abuses were known in the English Navy. And though the captain of an English armed ship is authorized to inflict, at his own discretion, more than a dozen lashes, I think 3 dozen, yet it is to be doubted whether, upon the whole, there is as much flogging at present in the English Navy as in the American. The chivalric Virginian, John Randolph of Roanoke, declared, in his place in Congress, that on board of the American man of war that carried him out ambassador to Russia, he had witnessed more flogging than had taken place on his own plantation of 500 African slaves in 10 years. Certain it is, from what I have personally seen, that the English officers, as a general thing, seem to be less disliked by their crews than the American officers by theirs. The reason probably is that many of them, from their station in life, have been more accustomed to social command. Hence, quarterdeck authority sits more naturally on them. A coarse, vulgar man, who happens to rise to high naval rank by the exhibition of talents not incompatible with vulgarity, invariably proves a tyrant to his crew. It is a thing that American men of war's men have often observed, that the lieutenants from the southern states, the descendants of the old Virginians, are much less severe, and much more gentle and gentlemanly in command, than the northern officers as a class. According to the present laws and usages of the Navy, a seaman, for the most trivial alleged offenses, of which he may be entirely innocent, must, without a trial, undergo a penalty the traces whereof he carries to the grave. For to a man of war's man's experienced eye the marks of a naval scourging with the cat are through life discernible. And with these marks on his back, this image of his Creator must rise at the last day. Yet so untouchable is true dignity, that there are cases wherein to be flogged at the gangway is no dishonor, though to abase and hurl down the last pride of some sailor who has piqued him, be sometimes the secret motive with some malicious officer in procuring him to be condemned to the lash. But this feeling of the innate dignity remaining untouched, though outwardly the body be scarred for the whole term of the natural life, is one of the hushed things, buried among the holiest privacies of the soul. A thing between a man's God and himself, and forever undiscernible by our fellow men, who account that a degradation which seems so to the corporal eye. But what torments must that seaman undergo who, while his back bleeds at the gangway, bleeds agonized drops of shame from his soul? Are we not justified in immeasurably denouncing this thing? Join hands with me, then, and, in the name of that being in whose image the flogged sailor is made, let us demand of legislators, by what right they dare profane what God himself accounts sacred. Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman? Asks the intrepid apostle, well knowing as a Roman citizen that it was not. And now, 1800 years after, is it lawful for you, my countrymen, to scourge a man that is an American? To scourge him round the world in your frigates? It is to no purpose that you apologetically appeal to the general depravity of the man of war's man. Depravity in the oppressed is no apology for the oppressor, but rather an additional stigma to him as being in a large degree the effect and not the cause and justification of oppression. Chapter 35. Flogging not lawful. It is next to idle at the present day merely to denounce an iniquity. Be ours, then, a different task. If there are any 3 things opposed to the genius of the American Constitution, they are these: irresponsibility in a judge, unlimited discretionary authority in an executive, and the union of an irresponsible judge and an unlimited executive in one person. Yet, by virtue of an enactment of Congress, all the commodores in the American Navy are obnoxious to these 3 charges, so far as concerns the punishment of the sailor for alleged misdemeanors not particularly set forth in the Articles of War. Here is the enactment in question. XXXII of the Articles of War. All crimes committed by persons belonging to the Navy, which are not specified in the foregoing articles, shall be punished according to the laws and customs in such cases at sea. This is the article that, above all others, puts the scourge into the hands of the captain, calls him to no account for its exercise, and furnishes him with an ample warrant for inflictions of cruelty upon the common sailor, hardly credible to landsmen. By this article the captain is made a legislator, as well as a judge and an executive. So far as it goes, it absolutely leaves to his discretion to decide what things shall be considered crimes, and what shall be the penalty, whether an accused person has been guilty of actions by him declared to be crimes, and how, when, and where the penalty shall be inflicted. In the American Navy there is an everlasting suspension of the habeas corpus. Upon the bare allegation of misconduct, there is no law to restrain the captain from imprisoning a seaman, and keeping him confined at his pleasure. While I was in the Neversink, the captain of an American sloop of war, from undoubted motives of personal pique, kept a seaman confined in the brig for upward of a month. Certainly the necessities of navies warrant a code for their government more stringent than the law that governs the land. But that code should conform to the spirit of the political institutions of the country that ordains it. It should not convert into slaves some of the citizens of a nation of freemen. Such objections cannot be urged against the laws of the Russian Navy, not essentially different from our own, because the laws of that navy, creating the absolute one-man power in the captain, and vesting in him the authority to scourge, conform in spirit to the territorial laws of Russia, which is ruled by an autocrat, and whose courts inflict the knout upon the subjects of the land. But with us it is different. Our institutions claim to be based upon broad principles of political liberty and equality, whereas it would hardly affect one iota the condition on shipboard of an American man-of-war's man, were he transferred to the Russian Navy and made a subject of the Tsar. As a sailor, he shares none of our civil immunities. The law of our soil in no respect accompanies the national floating timbers grown thereon, and to which he clings as his home. For him our revolution was in vain. To him our declaration of independence is a lie. It is not sufficiently borne in mind, perhaps, that though the naval code comes under the head of the martial law, yet, in time of peace, and in the thousand questions arising between man and man on board ship, this code, to a certain extent, may not improperly be deemed municipal. With its crew of 800 or 1,000 men, a three-decker is a city on the sea. But in most of these matters between man and man, the captain, instead of being a magistrate, dispensing what the law promulgates, is an absolute ruler, making and unmaking law as he pleases. It will be seen that the XXTH of the Articles of War provides that if any person in the Navy negligently perform the duties assigned him, he shall suffer such punishment as a court-martial shall adjudge. But if the offender be a private, common sailor, he may, at the discretion of the captain, be put in irons or flogged. It is needless to say that in cases where an officer commits a trivial violation of this law, a court-martial is seldom or never called to sit upon his trial. But in the sailor's case, he is at once condemned to the lash. Thus, one set of sea citizens is exempted from a law that is hung in terror over others. What would landsmen think were the state of New York to pass a law against some offense, affixing a fine as a penalty, and then add to that law a section restricting its penal operation to mechanics and day laborers, exempting all gentlemen with an income of $1,000. Yet thus, in the spirit of its practical operation, even thus stands a good part of the naval laws wherein naval flogging is involved. But a law should be universal, and include in its possible penal operations the very judge himself who gives decisions upon it. Nay, the very judge who expounds it. Had Sir William Blackstone violated the laws of England, he would have been brought before the bar over which he had presided, and would there have been tried, with the counsel for the crown reading to him, perhaps, from a copy of his own commentaries. And should he have been found guilty, he would have suffered like the meanest subject, according to law. How is it in an American frigate? Let one example suffice. By the Articles of War, and especially by Article 1, an American captain may, and frequently does, inflict a severe and degrading punishment upon a sailor, while he himself is forever removed from the possibility of undergoing the like disgrace, and in all probability from undergoing any punishment whatever, even if guilty of the same thing, contention with his equals, for instance, for which he punishes another. Yet both sailor and captain are American citizens. Now, in the language of Blackstone, again there is a law, coeval with mankind, dictated by God himself, superior in obligation to any other, and no human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. That law is the law of nature, among the three great principles of which Justinian includes that to every man should be rendered his due. But we have seen that the laws involving flogging in the Navy do not render to every man his due, since in some cases they indirectly exclude the officers from any punishment whatever, and in all cases protect them from the scourge which is inflicted upon the sailor. Therefore, according to Blackstone and Justinian, those laws have no binding force, and every American man-of-war's man would be morally justified in resisting the scourge to the uttermost, and in so resisting would be religiously justified in what would be judicially styled the act of mutiny itself. If, then, these scourging laws be for any reason necessary, make them binding upon all who of right come under their sway, and let us see an honest commodore, duly authorized by Congress, condemning to the lash a transgressing captain by the side of a transgressing sailor. And if the commodore himself prove a transgressor, let us see one of his brother commodores take up the lash against him, even as the boatswain's mates, the Navy executioners, are often called upon to scourge each other. Or will you say that a Navy officer is a man, but that an American-born citizen, whose grandsire may have ennobled him by pouring out his blood at Bunker Hill, will you say that, by entering the service of his country as a common seaman, and standing ready to fight her foes, he thereby loses his manhood at the very time he most asserts it? Will you say that, by so doing, he degrades himself to the liability of the scourge, but if he tarries ashore in time of danger, he is safe from that indignity? All our linked states, all 4 continents of mankind, unite in denouncing such a thought. We plant the question, then, on the topmost argument of all. Irrespective of incidental considerations, we assert that flogging in the Navy is opposed to the essential dignity of man, which no legislator has a right to violate, that it is oppressive and glaringly unequal in its operations, that it is utterly repugnant to the spirit of our democratic institutions, indeed that it involves a lingering trait of the worst times of a barbarous feudal aristocracy. In a word, we denounce it as religiously, morally, and immutably wrong. No matter, then, what may be the consequences of its abolition, no matter if we have to dismantle our fleets, and our unprotected commerce should fall a prey to the spoiler, the awful admonitions of justice and humanity demand that abolition without procrastination. In a voice that is not to be mistaken, demand that abolition today. It is not a dollar-and-cent question of expediency. It is a matter of right and wrong. And if any man can lay his hand on his heart, and solemnly say that this scourging is right, let that man but once feel the lash on his own back, and in his agony you will hear the apostate call the 7th heavens to witness that it is wrong. And, in the name of immortal manhood, would to God that every man who upholds this thing were scourged at the gangway till he recanted. Chapter 36. Flogging not necessary. But Whitejacket is ready to come down from the lofty masthead of an eternal principle, and fight you, commodores and captains of the Navy, on your own quarterdeck with your own weapons at your own paces. Exempt yourselves from the lash, you take Bible oaths to it that it is indispensable for others. You swear that, without the lash, no armed ship can be kept in suitable discipline. Be it proved to you, officers, and stamped upon your foreheads, that herein you are utterly wrong. Send them to Collingwood, said Lord Nelson, and he will bring them to order. This was the language of that renowned admiral, when his officers reported to him certain seamen of the fleet as wholly ungovernable. Send them to Collingwood. And who was Collingwood? That, after these Navy rebels had been imprisoned and scourged without being brought to order, Collingwood could convert them to docility. Who Admiral Collingwood was, as an historical hero, history herself will tell you. Nor, in whatever triumphal hall they may be hanging, will the captured flags of Trafalgar fail to rustle at the mention of that name. But what Collingwood was as a disciplinarian on board the ships he commanded perhaps needs to be said. He was an officer, then, who held in abhorrence all corporal punishment, who, though seeing more active service than any sea officer of his time, yet, for years together, governed his men without inflicting the lash. But these seamen of his must have been most exemplary saints to have proved docile under so lenient a sway. Were they saints? Answer, ye jails and almshouses throughout the length and breadth of Great Britain, which, in Collingwood's time, were swept clean of the last lingering villain and pauper to man his Majesty's fleets. Still more, that was a period when the uttermost resources of England were taxed to the quick, when the masts of her multiplied fleets almost transplanted her forests, all standing to the sea, when British press gangs not only boarded foreign ships on the high seas and boarded foreign pierheads, but boarded their own merchantmen at the mouth of the Thames, and boarded the very firesides along its banks, when Englishmen were knocked down and dragged into the navy, like cattle into the slaughterhouse, with every mortal provocation to a mad desperation against the service that thus ran their unwilling heads into the muzzles of the enemy's cannon. This was the time, and these the men that Collingwood governed without the lash. I know it has been said that Lord Collingwood began by inflicting severe punishments, and afterward ruling his sailors by the mere memory of a bygone terror, which he could at pleasure revive, and that his sailors knew this, and hence their good behavior under a lenient sway. But, granting the quoted assertion to be true, how comes it that many American captains, who, after inflicting as severe punishment as ever Collingwood could have authorized, how comes it that they, also, have not been able to maintain good order without subsequent floggings, after once showing to the crew with what terrible attributes they were invested? But it is notorious, and a thing that I myself, in several instances, know to have been the case, that in the American Navy, where corporal punishment has been most severe, it has also been most frequent. But it is incredible that, with such crews as Lord Collingwood's, composed, in part, of the most desperate characters, the rakings of the jails, it is incredible that such a set of men could have been governed by the mere memory of the lash. Some other influence must have been brought to bear. Mainly, no doubt, the influence wrought by a powerful brain and a determined, intrepid spirit over a miscellaneous rabble. It is well known that Lord Nelson himself, in point of policy, was averse to flogging, and that, too, when he had witnessed the mutinous effects of government abuses in the Navy, unknown in our times, and which, to the terror of all England, developed themselves at the great mutiny of the Nore, an outbreak that for several weeks jeopardized the very existence of the British Navy. But we may press this thing nearly 2 centuries further back, for it is a matter of historical doubt whether, in Robert Blake's time, Cromwell's great admiral, such a thing as flogging was known at the gangways of his victorious fleets. And as in this matter we cannot go further back than to Blake, so we cannot advance further than to our own time, which shows Commodore Stockton, during the recent war with Mexico, governing the American squadron in the Pacific without employing the scourge. But if of 3 famous English admirals one has abhorred flogging, another almost governed his ships without it, and to the third it may be supposed to have been unknown, while an American commander has, within the present year almost, been enabled to sustain the good discipline of an entire squadron in time of war without having an instrument of scourging on board, what inevitable inferences must be drawn, and how disastrous to the mental character of all advocates of Navy flogging, who may happen to be Navy officers themselves. It cannot have escaped the discernment of any observer of mankind, that, in the presence of its conventional inferiors, conscious imbecility in power often seeks to carry off that imbecility by assumptions of lordly severity. The amount of flogging on board an American man-of-war is, in many cases, in exact proportion to the professional and intellectual incapacity of her officers to command. Thus, in these cases, the law that authorizes flogging does but put a scourge into the hand of a fool. In most calamitous instances this has been shown. It is a matter of record that some English ships of war have fallen a prey to the enemy through the insubordination of the crew, induced by the witless cruelty of their officers. Officers so armed by the law that they could inflict that cruelty without restraint. Nor have there been wanting instances where the seamen have ran away with their ships, as in the case of the Hermione and Danae, and forever rid themselves of the outrageous inflictions of their officers by sacrificing their lives to their fury. Events like these aroused the attention of the British public at the time. But it was a tender theme, the public agitation of which the government was anxious to suppress. Nevertheless, whenever the thing was privately discussed, these terrific mutinies, together with the then prevailing insubordination of the men in the Navy, were almost universally attributed to the exasperating system of flogging. And the necessity for flogging was generally believed to be directly referable to the impressment of such crowds of dissatisfied men. And in high quarters it was held that if, by any mode, the English fleet could be manned without resource to coercive measures, then the necessity of flogging would cease. If we abolish either impressment or flogging, the abolition of the other will follow as a matter of course. This was the language of the Edinburgh Review at a still later period, 1824. If, then, the necessity of flogging in the British Armed Marine was solely attributed to the impressment of the seamen, what faintest shadow of reason is there for the continuance of this barbarity in the American service, which is wholly freed from the reproach of impressment? It is true that, during a long period of non-impressment, and even down to the present day flogging has been and still is the law of the English Navy. But in things of this kind England should be nothing to us, except an example to be shunned. Nor should wise legislators wholly govern themselves by precedents, and conclude that, since scourging has so long prevailed, some virtue must reside in it. Not so. The world has arrived at a period which renders it the part of wisdom to pay homage to the prospective precedents of the future in preference to those of the past. The past is dead and has no resurrection, but the future is endowed with such a life that it lives to us even in anticipation. The past is, in many things, the foe of mankind. The future is, in all things, our friend. In the past is no hope. The future is both hope and fruition. The past is the textbook of tyrants, the future the Bible of the free. Those who are solely governed by the past stand like Lot's wife, crystallized in the act of looking backward, and forever incapable of looking before. Let us leave the past, then, to dictate laws to immovable China. Let us abandon it to the Chinese legitimists of Europe. But for us, we will have another captain to rule over us, that captain who ever marches at the head of his troop and beckons them forward, not lingering in the rear, and impeding their march with lumbering baggage wagons of old precedents. This is the past. But in many things we Americans are driven to a rejection of the maxims of the past, seeing that, ere long, the van of the nations must, of right, belong to ourselves. There are occasions when it is for America to make precedents, and not to obey them. We should, if possible, prove a teacher to posterity, instead of being the pupil of bygone generations. More shall come after us than have gone before. The world is not yet middle-aged. Escaped from the house of bondage, Israel of old did not follow after the ways of the Egyptians. To her was given an express dispensation. To her were given new things under the sun. And we Americans are the peculiar, chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. 70 years ago we escaped from thrall. And, besides our first birthright, embracing one continent of earth, God has given to us, for a future inheritance, the broad domains of the political pagans, that shall yet come and lie down under the shade of our ark, without bloody hands being lifted. God has predestinated, mankind expects, great things from our race, and great things we feel in our souls. The rest of the nations must soon be in our rear. We are the pioneers of the world, the advance guard, sent on through the wilderness of untried things, to break a new path in the new world that is ours. In our youth is our strength. In our inexperience, our wisdom. At a period when other nations have but lisped, our deep voice is heard afar. Long enough have we been skeptics with regard to ourselves, and doubted whether, indeed, the political Messiah had come. But he has come in us, if we would but give utterance to his promptings. And let us always remember that with ourselves, almost for the first time in the history of earth, national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy. For we cannot do a good to America but we give alms to the world. Chapter 37. Some superior old London dock, from the wine coolers of Neptune. We had just slid into pleasant weather, drawing near to the tropics, when all hands were thrown into a wonderful excitement by an event that eloquently appealed to many palates. A man at the foretopsail yard sung out that there were 8 or 10 dark objects floating on the sea, some 3 points off our lee bow. "Keep her off 3 points," cried Captain Claret, to the quartermaster at the Seawan. And thus, with all our batteries, storerooms, and 500 men, with their baggage and beds and provisions, at one move of a round bit of mahogany, our great embattled ark edged away for the strangers, as easily as a boy turns to the right or left in pursuit of insects in the field. Directly the man on the topsail yard reported the dark objects to be hogsheads. Instantly all the topmen were straining their eyes, in delirious expectation of having their long grog fast broken at last, and that, too, by what seemed an almost miraculous intervention. It was a curious circumstance that, without knowing the contents of the hogsheads, they yet seemed certain that the staves encompassed the thing they longed for. Sail was now shortened, our headway was stopped, and a cutter was lowered, with orders to tow the fleet of strangers alongside. The men sprang to their oars with a will, and soon 5 goodly puncheons lay wallowing in the sea, just under the main chains. We got overboard the slings, and hoisted them out of the water. It was a sight that Bacchus and his bacchanals would have gloated over. Each puncheon was of a deep green color, so covered with minute barnacles and shellfish, and streaming with seaweed, that it needed long searching to find out their bungholes. They looked like venerable old loggerhead turtles. How long they had been tossing about, and making voyages for the benefit of the flavor of their contents, no one could tell. In trying to raft them ashore or on board of some merchant ship, they must have drifted off to sea. This we inferred from the ropes that lengthwise united them, and which, from one point of view, made them resemble a long sea serpent. They were struck into the gun deck, where, the eager crowd being kept off by sentries, the cooper was called with his tools. "Bung up and bilge free!" he cried, in an ecstasy, flourishing his driver and hammer. Upon clearing away the barnacles and moss, a flat sort of shellfish was found, closely adhering like a California shell, right over one of the bungs. Doubtless this shellfish had there taken up his quarters, and thrown his own body into the breach, in order the better to preserve the precious contents of the cask. The bystanders were breathless, when at last this puncheon was canted over and a tin pot held to the orifice. What was to come forth? Salt water or wine? But a rich purple tide soon settled the question, and the lieutenant assigned to taste it, with a loud and satisfactory smack of his lips, pronounced it port. "Oh, Porto!" cried Mad Jack, and no mistake. But, to the surprise, grief, and consternation of the sailors, an order now came from the quarterdeck to strike the strangers down into the main-hold. This proceeding occasioned all sorts of censorious observations upon the captain, who, of course, had authorized it. It must be related here that, on the passage out from home, the Neversink had touched at Madeira, and there, as is often the case with men of war, the Commodore and captain had laid in a goodly stock of wines for their own private tables, and the benefit of their foreign visitors. And although the Commodore was a small, spare man, who evidently emptied but few glasses, yet Captain Claret was a portly gentleman, with a crimson face, whose father had fought at the Battle of the Brandywine, and whose brother had commanded the well-known frigate named in honor of that engagement. And his whole appearance evinced that Captain Claret himself had fought many Brandywine battles ashore in honor of his sire's memory, and commanded in many bloodless Brandywine actions at sea. It was therefore with some savor of provocation that the sailors held forth on the ungenerous conduct of Captain Claret, in stepping in between them and Providence, as it were, which by this lucky windfall they held, seemed bent upon relieving their necessities, while Captain Claret himself, with an inexhaustible cellar, emptied his Madeira decanters at his leisure. But next day all hands were electrified by the old familiar sound, so long hushed, of the drum rolling to grog. After that the port was served out twice a day, till all was expended. Chapter 38. The Chaplain and Chapel in a Man-o'-F War. The next day was Sunday, a fact set down in the almanac spite of merchant seaman's maxim, that there are no Sundays of soundings. No Sundays off soundings. Indeed, no Sundays on shipboard. You may as well say there should be no Sundays in churches. For is not a ship modeled after a church? Has it not 3 spires, 3 steeples? Yea, and on the gun deck, a bell and a belfry? And does not that bell merrily peal every Sunday morning, to summon the crew to devotions? At any rate, there were Sundays on board this particular frigate of ours, and a clergyman also. He was a slender, middle-aged man, of an amiable deportment and irreproachable conversation. But I must say that his sermons were but ill calculated to benefit the crew. He had drank at the mystic fountain of Plato. His head had been turned by the Germans, and this I will say, that White Jacket himself saw him with Coleridge's Biographia Literaria in his hand. Fancy, now, this transcendental divine standing behind a gun carriage on the main deck, and addressing 500 salt sea sinners upon the psychological phenomena of the soul, and the ontological necessity of every sailor's saving it at all hazards. He enlarged upon the follies of the ancient philosophers, learnedly alluded to the Phaedon of Plato, exposed the follies of Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's De Scylla, by arraying against that clever pagan author the admired tract of Tertullian, De Prescriptionibus Hereticorum, and concluded by a Sanskrit invocation. He was particularly hard upon the Gnostics and Marcionites of the 2nd century of the Christian era, but he never, in the remotest manner, attacked the everyday vices of the 19th century, as eminently illustrated in our man-of-war world. Concerning drunkenness, fighting, flogging, and oppression, things expressly or impliedly prohibited by Christianity, he never said aught. But the most mighty commodore and captain sat before him, and in general, if, in a monarchy, the state formed the audience of the church, little evangelical piety will be preached. Hence, the harmless, non-committal abstrusities of our chaplain were not to be wondered at. He was no Massillon, to thunder forth his ecclesiastical rhetoric, even when a Louis le Grand was enthroned among his congregation. Nor did the chaplains who preached on the quarter-deck of Lord Nelson ever allude to the guilty Felix, nor to Delilah, nor practically reason of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, when that renowned admiral sat, sword-belted, before them. During these Sunday discourses, the officers always sat in a circle round the chaplain, and, with a businesslike air, steadily preserved the utmost propriety. In particular, our old Commodore himself made a point of looking intensely edified, and not a sailor on board but believed that the Commodore, being the greatest man present, must alone comprehend the mystic sentences that fell from our parson's lips. Of all the noble lords in the wardroom, this Lord Spiritual, with the exception of the purser, was in the highest favor with the Commodore, who frequently conversed with him in a close and confidential manner. Nor, upon reflection, was this to be marveled at, seeing how efficacious, in all despotic governments, it is for the throne and altar to go hand in hand. The accommodations of our chapel were very poor. We had nothing to sit on but the great gun rammers and capstan bars, placed horizontally upon shot boxes. These seats were exceedingly uncomfortable, wearing out our trousers and our tempers, and, no doubt, impeded the conversion of many valuable souls. To say the truth, men-of-war's men, in general, make but poor auditors upon these occasions, and adopt every possible means to elude them. Often the boatswain's mates were obliged to drive the men to service, violently swearing upon these occasions, as upon every other. Go to prayers, and you, to prayers, you rascals, to prayers. In this clerical invitation Captain Claret would frequently unite. At this Jack Chase would sometimes make merry. "Come, boys, don't hang back," he would say. "Come, let us go hear the parson talk about his Lord High Admiral Plato and Commodore Socrates." But, in one instance, grave exception was taken to this summons. A remarkably serious but bigoted seaman, a sheet-anchor-man, whose private devotions may hereafter be alluded to, once touched his hat to the captain, and respectfully said, "Sir, I am a Baptist. The chaplain is an Episcopalian. His form of worship is not mine. I do not believe with him, and it is against my conscience to be under his ministry. May I be allowed, sir, not to attend service on the half-deck?" "You will be allowed, sir," said the captain haughtily, "to obey the laws of the ship. If you absent yourself from prayers on Sunday mornings, you know the penalty." According to the Articles of War, the captain was perfectly right. But if any law requiring an American to attend divine service against his will be a law respecting the establishment of religion, then the Articles of War are, in this one particular, opposed to the American Constitution, which expressly says, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or the free exercise thereof." But this is only one of several things in which the Articles of War are repugnant to that instrument. They will be glanced at in another part of the narrative. The motive which prompts the introduction of chaplains into the Navy cannot but be warmly responded to by every Christian. But it does not follow that because chaplains are to be found in men of war, that, under the present system, they achieve much good, or that, under any other, they ever will. How can it be expected that the religion of peace should flourish in an oaken castle of war? How can it be expected that the clergyman, whose pulpit is a 42-pounder, should convert sinners to a faith that enjoins them to turn the right cheek when the left is smitten? How is it to be expected that when, according to the XLII of the Articles of War, as they now stand unrepealed on the statute book, a bounty shall be paid to the officers and crew by the United States government of $20 for each person on board any ship of an enemy which shall be sunk or destroyed by any United States ship, and when, by a subsequent section, 7, it is provided, among other apportionings, that the chaplain shall receive 2/20 of this price paid for sinking and destroying ships full of human beings? How is it to be expected that a clergyman, thus provided for, should prove efficacious in enlarging upon the criminality of Judas, who, for 30 pieces of silver, betrayed his master. Although, by the regulations of the Navy, each seaman's mess on board the Neversink was furnished with a Bible, these Bibles were seldom or never to be seen, except on Sunday mornings, when usage demands that they shall be exhibited by the cooks of the messes, when the master-at-arms goes his rounds on the berth-deck. At such times, they usually surmounted a highly polished tin pot placed on the lid of the chest. Yet, for all this, the Christianity of men-of-war's men, and their disposition to contribute to pious enterprises, are often relied upon. Several times subscription papers were circulated among the crew of the Neversink, while in harbor, under the direct patronage of the chaplain. One was for the purpose of building a seaman's chapel in China, another to pay the salary of a tract distributor in Greece, a third to raise a fund for the benefit of an African colonization society. Where the captain himself is a moral man, he makes a far better chaplain for his crew than any clergyman can be. This is sometimes illustrated in the case of sloops of war and armed brigs, which are not allowed a regular chaplain. I have known one crew, who were warmly attached to a naval commander worthy of their love, who have mustered even with alacrity to the call to prayer, and when their captain would read the Church of England service to them, would present a congregation not to be surpassed for earnestness and devotion by any Scottish kirk. It seemed like family devotions, where the head of the house is foremost in confessing himself before his Maker. But our own hearts are our best prayer rooms, and the chaplains who can most help us are ourselves. Chapter 39. The frigate in harbor. The boats. Grand state reception of the Commodore. In good time we were up with the parallel of Rio de Janeiro, and standing in for the land, the mist soon cleared, and high aloft the famed sugar loaf pinnacle was seen, our bowsprit pointing for it straight as a die. As we glided on toward our anchorage, the bands of the various men of war in harbor saluted us with national airs, and gallantly lowered their ensigns. Nothing can exceed the courteous etiquette of these ships, of all nations, in greeting their brethren. Of all men, your accomplished duellist is generally the most polite. We lay in Rio some weeks, lazily taking in stores and otherwise preparing for the passage home. But though Rio is one of the most magnificent bays in the world, though the city itself contains many striking objects, and though much might be said of the Sugar Loaf and Signal Hill Heights, and the little islet of Lucia, and the fortified Isla dos Cobras or Isle of the Snakes, though the only anacondas and adders now found in the arsenals there are great guns and pistols, and Lord Wood's nose, a lofty eminence said by seamen to resemble his lordship's conch shell, and the praise du Flamingo, a noble tract of beach so called from its having been the resort in olden times of those gorgeous birds, and the charming bay of Botafogo which, spite of its name, is fragrant as the neighboring Laranjeiros or Valley of the Oranges, and the green Gloria Hill, surmounted by the belfries of the queenly church of Nossa Senhora de Gloria, and the iron-gray Benedictine convent nearby, and the fine drive and promenade, Paseo Publico, and the massive arch-over-arch aqueduct, Arcos de Carico, and the Emperor's Palace, and the Empress's Gardens, and the fine Church de Candelaria, and the gilded throne on wheels, drawn by 8 silken, silver-belled mules, in which, of pleasant evenings, His Imperial Majesty is driven out of town to his Moorish villa of St. Christova. Though much might be said of all this, yet must I forbear, if I may, and adhere to my one proper object, the world in a man of war. Behold now the Neversink under a new aspect. With all her batteries, she is tranquilly lying in harbor, surrounded by English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Brazilian 74s, moored in the deep green water, close under the lee of that oblong, castellated mass of rock, Ilha dos Cobras, which, with its portholes and lofty flagstaffs, looks like another man of war, fast anchored in the way. But what is an insular fortress, indeed, but an embattled landslide into the sea from the world Gibraltars and Quebecs? And what a mainland fortress but a few decks of a line-of-battle ship transplanted ashore? They are all one, all as King David, men of war from their youth. Behold now the Neversink at her anchors, in many respects presenting a different appearance from what she presented at sea. Nor is the routine of life on board the same. At sea there is more to employ the sailors, and less temptation to violations of the law. Whereas, in port, unless some particular service engages them, they lead the laziest of lives, beset by all the allurements of the shore, though perhaps that shore they may never touch. Unless you happen to belong to one of the numerous boats, which, in a man-of-war in harbor, are continually plying to and from the land, you are mostly thrown upon your own resources to while away the time. Whole days frequently pass without your being individually called upon to lift a finger. For though, in the merchant service, they make a point of keeping the men always busy about something or other, yet to employ 500 sailors when there is nothing definite to be done wholly surpasses the ingenuity of any first lieutenant in the Navy. As mention has just been made of the numerous boats employed in harbor, something more may as well be put down concerning them. Our frigate carried a very large boat, as big as a small sloop, called a launch, which was generally used for getting off wood, water, and other bulky articles. Besides this, she carried 4 boats of an arithmetical progression in point of size, the largest being known as the first cutter, the next largest the second cutter, then the third and fourth cutters. She also carried a commodore's barge, a captain's gig, and a dinghy, a small yawl with a crew of apprentice boys. All these boats, except the dinghy, had their regular crews who were subordinate to their coxswains, petty officers, receiving pay in addition to their seamen's wages. The launch was manned by the old Tritons of the forecastle, who were no ways particular about their dress, while the other boats, commissioned for genteeler duties, were rowed by young fellows, mostly, who had a dandy eye to their personal appearance. Above all, the officers see to it that the commodore's barge and the captain's gig are manned by gentlemanly youths, who may do credit to their country, and form agreeable objects for the eyes of the commodore or captain to repose upon as he tranquilly sits in the stern, when pulled ashore by his bargemen or gigmen, as the case may be. Some sailors are very fond of belonging to the boats, and deem it a great honor to be a commodore's bargeman, but others, perceiving no particular distinction in that office, do not court it so much. On the second day after arriving at Rio, one of the gigmen fell sick, and, to my no small concern, I found myself temporarily appointed to his place. "Come, white jacket, rig yourself in white. That's the gig's uniform today. You are a gigman, my boy? Give ye joy." This was the first announcement of the fact that I heard, but soon after it was officially ratified. I was about to seek the first lieutenant, and plead the scantiness of my wardrobe, which wholly disqualified me to fill so distinguished a station, when I heard the bugler call away the gig. And without more ado, I slipped into a clean frock, which a messmate doffed for my benefit, and soon after found myself pulling off his high mightiness, the captain, to an English 74. As we were bounding along, the coxswain suddenly cried, "Oars!" At the word every oar was suspended in the air, while our commodore's barge floated by, bearing that dignitary himself. At the sight, Captain Claret removed his chapeau, and saluted profoundly, our boat lying motionless on the water. But the barge never stopped, and the Commodore made but a slight return to the obsequious salute he had received. We then resumed rowing, and presently I heard "Oars!" again, but from another boat, the second cutter, which turned out to be carrying a lieutenant ashore. It was now Captain Claret's turn to be honored. The cutter lay still and the lieutenant off hat, while the captain only nodded, and we kept on our way. This naval etiquette is very much like the etiquette at the grand port of Constantinople, where, after washing the sublime sultan's feet, the Grand Vizier avenges himself on an emir, who does the same office for him. When we arrived aboard the English 74, the captain was received with the usual honors, and the gig's crew were conducted below, and hospitably regaled with some spirits, served out by order of the officer of the deck. Soon after, the English crew went to quarters, and as they stood up at their guns, all along the main deck, a row of beef-fed Britons, stalwart-looking fellows, I was struck with the contrast they afforded to similar sights on board of the Neversink. For on board of us our quarters showed an array of rather slender, lean-checked chaps. But then I made no doubt that, in a sea tussle, these lantern-jawed varlets would have approved themselves as slender Damascus blades, nimble and flexible, whereas these Britons would have been, perhaps, as sturdy broadswords. Yet everyone remembers that story of Saladin and Richard trying their respective blades. How gallant Richard clove an anvil in twain, or something quite as ponderous, and Saladin elegantly severed a cushion. So that the two monarchs were even each excelling in his way, though, unfortunately for my simile, in a patriotic point of view, Richard whipped Saladin's armies in the end. There happened to be a lord on board of this ship, the younger son of an earl, they told me. He was a fine-looking fellow. I chanced to stand by when he put a question to an Irish captain of a gum. Upon the seaman's inadvertently saying sir to him, his lordship looked daggers at the slight, and the sailor, touching his hat 1,000 times, said, "Pardon, your honor. I meant to say my lord, sir." I was much pleased with an old white-headed musician, who stood at the main hatchway, with his enormous bass drum full before him, and thumping it sturdily to the tune of God Save the King. Though small mercy did he have on his drumheads. 2 little boys were clashing cymbals, and another was blowing a fife, with his cheeks puffed out like the plumpest of his country's plum puddings. When we returned from this trip, there again took place that ceremonious reception of our captain on board the vessel he commanded, which always had struck me as exceedingly diverting. In the first place, while in port, one of the quartermasters is always stationed on the poop with a spyglass, to look out for all boats approaching, and report the same to the officer of the deck. Also, who it is that may be coming in them, so that preparations may be made accordingly. As soon, then, as the gig touched the side, a mighty shrill piping was heard, as if some boys were celebrating the 4th of July with penny whistles. This proceeded from a boatswain's mate, who, standing at the gangway, was thus honoring the captain's return after his long and perilous absence. The captain then slowly mounted the ladder, and gravely marching through a lane of side boys, so-called, all in their best bibs and tuckers, and who stood making sly faces behind his back, was received by all the lieutenants in a body, their hats in their hands, and making a prodigious scraping and bowing, as if they had just graduated at a French dancing school. Meanwhile, preserving an erect, inflexible and ramrod carriage, and slightly touching his chapeau, the captain made his ceremonious way to the cabin, disappearing behind the scenes, like the pasteboard ghost in Hamlet. But these ceremonies are nothing to those in homage of the Commodore's arrival, even should he depart and arrive 20 times a day. Upon such occasions, the whole marine guard, except the sentries on duty, are marshaled on the quarter-deck, presenting arms as the Commodore passes them, while their commanding officer gives the military salute with his sword, as if making Masonic signs. Meanwhile, the boatswain himself, not a boatswain's mate, is keeping up a persevering whistling with his silver pipe, for the Commodore is never greeted with the rude whistle of a boatswain's subaltern. That would be positively insulting. All the lieutenants and midshipmen, besides the captain himself, are drawn up in a phalanx and off-hat together, and the side boys, whose number is now increased to 10 or 12, make an imposing display at the gangway, while the whole brass band, elevated upon the poop, strike up "See, the conquering hero comes." At least, this was the tune that our captain always hinted, by a gesture, to the captain of the band, whenever the Commodore arrived from shore. It conveyed a complimentary appreciation on the captain's part of the Commodore's heroism during the late war. To return to the gig. As I did not relish the idea of being a sort of body servant to Captain Claret, since his gigmen were often called upon to scrub his cabin floor and perform other duties for him, I made it my particular business to get rid of my appointment in his boat as soon as possible, and the next day after receiving it succeeded in procuring a substitute who was glad of the chance to fill the position I so much undervalued. And thus, with our counterlikes and dislikes, most of us men-of-war's men harmoniously dovetail into each other, and, by our very points of opposition, unite in a clever whole, like the parts of a Chinese puzzle. But as, in a Chinese puzzle, many pieces are hard to place, so there are some unfortunate fellows who can never slip into their proper angles, and thus the whole puzzle becomes a puzzle indeed, which is the precise condition of the greatest puzzle in the world, this man-of-war world itself. Chapter 40. Some of the ceremonies in a man-o'-war unnecessary and injurious. The ceremonials of a man-of-war, some of which have been described in the preceding chapter, may merit a reflection or two. The general usages of the American Navy are founded upon the usages that prevailed in the Navy of monarchical England more than a century ago, nor have they been materially altered since. And while both England and America have become greatly liberalized in the interval, while shore pomp in high places has come to be regarded by the more intelligent masses of men as belonging to the absurd, ridiculous, and mock-heroic, while that most truly august of all the majesties of earth, the President of the United States, may be seen entering his residence with his umbrella under his arm, and no brass band or military guard at his heels, and unostentatiously taking his seat by the side of the meanest citizen in a public conveyance. While this is the case, There still lingers in American men of war all the stilted etiquette and childish parade of the old-fashioned Spanish court of Madrid. Indeed, so far as the things that meet the eye are concerned, an American Commodore is by far a greater man than the president of 20 millions of freemen. But we plain people ashore might very willingly be content to leave these Commodores in the unmolested possession of their gilded penny whistles, rattles, and gewgaws, since they seem to take so much pleasure in them, were it not that all this is attended by consequences to their subordinates in the last degree to be deplored. While hardly anyone will question that a naval officer should be surrounded by circumstances calculated to impart a requisite dignity to his position, it is not the less certain that, by the excessive pomp he at present maintains, there is naturally and unavoidably generated a feeling of servility and debasement in the hearts of most of the seamen, who continually behold a fellow mortal flourishing over their heads like the archangel Michael with 1,000 wings. And as, in degree, this same pomp is observed toward their inferiors by all the grades of commissioned officers, even down to a midshipman, the evil is proportionately multiplied. It would not at all diminish a proper respect for the officers and subordination to their authority among the seamen, were all this idle parade, only ministering to the arrogance of the officers, without at all benefiting the state, completely done away. But to do so, we voters and lawgivers ourselves must be no respecters of persons. That saying about leveling upward, and not downward, may seem very fine to those who cannot see its self-involved absurdity. But the truth is that, to gain the true level, in some things we must cut downward. For how can you make every sailor a commodore? Or how raise the valleys, without filling them up with the superfluous tops of the hills? Some discreet but democratic legislation in this matter is much to be desired. And by bringing down naval officers, in these things at least, without affecting their legitimate dignity and authority, we shall correspondingly elevate the common sailor, without relaxing the subordination, in which he should by all means be retained. Dear listener, we close the pages on another tale, a journey through words, imagination, and emotion. Here at the Falls Audiobook, where stories flow like a river's current, carrying you to distant worlds and uncharted depths, we thank you for joining us. As always, we invite you to linger a little longer. Subscribe to our channel to discover more stories waiting to be heard, each a cascade of voices, ideas, and artistry. And remember, every great story begins with a single word. Perhaps the next one will begin with you. Until our voices meet again, may your days be filled with quiet moments, rich pages, and the soothing sound of a story well told. This is the Falls Audiobook, signing off.